So thank you all for coming today to this seminar on disrupting the scholarly establishment, how to create alternative and affirmative humanities institutions. So this seminar is the first in a series of 3 seminars. The next 2 seminars will be on radical methodologies for the post-humanities and on the aesthetics of the humanities, and dates for both will be announced soon. And together these seminars form the Disrupting the Humanities seminar series, which has been organized by Coventry University's Center for Disruptive Media. So within this new center, we study disruptive digital technologies, media that radically change an existing market, technology, and cultural value network. We currently have 3 main areas of research activity: open media, creative archiving and digitization, and virtual and mobile communications. So what we're trying to do, especially in our research on open media and open education, is rethink the way we do teaching, learning, research, and publishing, so that we can avoid uncritically repeating what have become our dominant scholarly practices. But next to researching, we also experiment with the development and use of disruptive digital media, including open source, open access, open data, and open education resources, and augmented reality, mobile, and geolocative media. And we also get engaged in disrupting and displacing existing markets ourselves, by creating and exploring new economic models and new institutions. So this includes open access and open media related initiatives, such as Culture Machine, Open Humanities Press, Liquid Theory TV, and the Living Books About Live book series. So herein we explore media disruption as part of a critical framework, where we adopt an original post-digital and post-humanities position. But all of this also comes to the fore in our work with students, where we actively try out open pedagogies and innovative learning styles. For instance, in our 4 open courses, including Pickbot and Creative Activism. So these are classes that simulate learning and teaching that is community-based, collaborative, and media-enabled, and that encourage our students to interact with extended communities of learning. So to achieve this, the classes on these courses are open to anyone, everywhere, to participate in, add to the discussions, and even to rip, remix, and mash up the courses. If you are interested, you can find more information on the centre at disruptivemedia.org.uk. So this seminar series then basically builds upon this work and aims to extend it further. It focuses in particular on doing scholarship in a post-humanities context, focusing on what post-humanist praxis or performance of scholarship might entail, whilst not neglecting the media devices, institutions, and economies that we use to communicate and distribute our research. It does want to critically explore the heritage that accompanies the present-day humanities, whilst reflecting on a possible open, alternative, and affirmative future humanities that questions its own humanist legacy. So related to this series aims to address a variety of themes, which you can see here, and questions. So what are the underlying humanist legacies within our performance of scholarship, and how can we critically engage with these from a post-humanities perspective? How can we think of foundational concepts and practices, such as authorship, text, the book, copyright, the university, and the conference differently, whilst questioning the political economy, the aesthetics, and the methodologies that came to accompany these humanistic institutions? And how can we use these insights to design new futures for the performance of scholarly research, communication, and publication practices in such a way that it remains open for new contexts and situations, new tools and technologies, and new forms of life and self? This is all the more important in a time where the value of the humanities remains highly contested, and where it is, as Rosie Baidotti has argued, of strategic importance for the humanities to mutate in order to battle increasing irrelevance. This series of events thus takes a critical look at how we as researchers should do research in a post-anthropocentric world, and the ethics, politics, and economics involved in these networked and relational processes. So one of the additional aims of this series of seminars is to experiment with opening up and rethinking the way we conduct events, seminars, and conferences. In what way can we challenge the time and location-bound format of the conference, as well as in some ways the self-contained and holistic nature of a conference paper? In which way can digital media, for instance, aid in breaking down the barriers that exist between a conference and a publication turning events like these into rich collections of resources that can be reused and reassembled. In an attempt to open up these events using digital and social media, we will just make extensive use of video conferencing, audio and video recording, as you can see here today, and hopefully in one of the following seminars also of live streaming of the events to make them accessible for a wider group of speakers and participants. So this seminar series is also accompanied by a wiki or resource platform, which you can see here, where resources related to the themes of the seminars, as well as the recordings and materials of the various seminars, will be brought together for reuse in research and education. As it is a wiki, everyone will be able to add his or her own material, which will hopefully turn it into a rich collection of resources. This wiki also functions to bind the various separate seminars together, enabling clearer connections between them. It also enables the building of a network and of communities around these events, lifting them out of their unique and in many ways still objectified settings. This wiki will then form the basis for a more formal publication, enabling the speakers to not only respond to the time and place-bound specific experience of the event, but also to the resources collected around the event, which in a way can become part of the publication in process. So kind of re-envisioning a selection of resources, videos, slides, papers, and presentations anew as a form of publication, that this might include material that has already been formally published elsewhere in a different version, also encourages the vision of research as process, drawing attention to the various iterations of research and how they can start to live a life of their own, separate from, while still connected to what is seen as the final publication. In this sense, a disruption of the final object of research happens through a re-evaluation and a recognition of the importance of its various different versions and iterations, which especially now with digital media, but also, for instance, through notes, drafts, sketches, and papers in a post-print context, continue to live next to the finalized project as fluid rhizomatic extensions. How can we then turn what is increasingly a digital conference platform into a reusable publishing and communication platform? So in this seminar today on disrupting the scholarly establishment, we focus on alternative ways of doing scholarship in a post-humanities context, bringing together scholars and practitioners that have actively tried to rethink our current dominant humanities institutions in an affirmative way by setting up and experimenting with new academic institutions and organizations. This seminar directly connects to some of the core themes that we investigate at the Center for Disruptive Media, rethinking and reperforming art and media education, and digital scholarly publishing. So this will basically be the structure of the seminar. We'll have two panels. In the first panel, we'll have a discussion at the end, which will be moderated by Gary Hall. Afterwards, in between, we'll have tea and coffee, and then there will be a second panel on art education. And there's also going to be a discussion after the second panel. So in the first panel, Scholarly Publishing, Scholar-led Initiatives and Experiments in Digital Publishing, Sarah, Andrew, and Greg will explore scholarly initiatives that are trying to rethink scholarly publishing by setting up their own structures while questioning established practices. So currently there's a lack of interest from the established commercial publishers in experimentation, in specialized work, and in publishing works in open access. These initiatives are thus actively involved in rethinking the current relationships of scholarly material production that exists between authors, publishers, distributors, libraries, and readers. The second panel, Art Education, Practice-Based Research and Open Art Education, New Structures and New Institutions, featuring Karen Newman and Mark America, will then focus on initiatives that have tried to break through the boundaries between artistic practices and scholarly research by focusing on developments in practice-based research in academic settings and on experiments in open art education. How can we establish and set up new structures and new institutions that question the division that still exists between art practices and scholarly research, between the lecturer and the learner, and between the confined learning space of the classroom and the outside world of knowledge and expertise? So for those of you who use Twitter, the hashtag that we will be using during this event is disruptive media. And you can also use it if you want to ask a question to one of the speakers or to the panel as a whole, as I will be monitoring the Twitter feed during the event. So before I finish this introduction and introduce our first speaker, Sarah, I would like to thank the people that have helped to make this event and the series as a whole happen. So first of all, a great thank you to the fantastic members of the Center for Disruptive Media, and most importantly to Gary Hall for his feedback during the organizational process. Andrew Foster and Sonia Lal have helped with marketing and organizational support. And we've had great tech support for the wiki platform, the video recording, and the production and video conferencing from, amongst others, Pete Woodbridge, Ross Varney, Spencer James, Greg Godard, Paul Atkins, and Greg Milligan here at Coventry University, and from Felix Burgos and Shahid from UMBC, enabling things from Greg Saper's side. There are also some magnificent students that have been helping me out, and you can see them behind the cameras here, most notably Conrad Maselko and Jonathan Aldridge, and also Nathaniel McCurr, if I get that correctly, who have been actively involved in thinking about and producing digital experiments to make these events more collaborative and interactive, both in the way we produce and record, as well as in the way we disseminate them. Finally, there are Daine McKelly and Francine Broekhuis, who are helping out with the camera work, the tweeting, and with the live blogging. And of course, last but not least, I'd like to thank our fantastic speakers for today for their contributions to the series. So I'm going to introduce Saer now. So Saer Kember is a writer and academic. She is Professor of New Technologies of Communication at Goldsmiths, University of London. Her work incorporates new media, photography, and feminist cultural approaches to science and technology. Publications include a novel and a short story, The Optical Effects of Lightning, 2011, and The Mysterious Case of Mr. Charles D. Levi, 2010. Her latest monograph with Joanna Selinska is Life After New Media, Mediation as a Vital Process, from MIT, 2012. She co-edits the journals of Photographies and Feminist Theory, and previous publications include Virtual Anxiety, Photography, New Technologies and Subjectivity, 1998, Cyber-Feminism and Artificial Life, 2003, and the co-edited volume Inventive Life, Towards the New Vitalism, 2006. With Janice Jeffries, Saer Kember is co-PI of an RCUK funded project on digital publishing, part of CREATE, which is the Center for Creativity, Copyright, Regulation, Enterprise and Technology. And towards this project, she's currently writing an article entitled Why Write? Feminism, Publishing and the Politics of Communication. And Saer is also in the process of setting up the Goldsmiths Press, which she will hopefully be talking about today. So here is Saer. Picture presentation.
Okay, thanks. So let me just see if I can get my. Are you loading me up? Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So this, my title is a little facetious, to say the least. I've kind of taken my cue from actually a piece I enjoyed very much by Joanna Drucker in the LA Review of Books, the nicely named Pixel Dust. Illusions of Innovation in Scholarly Publishing. I mean, she's basically making an argument against too much hype about the transition from print to digital by saying, look, it's distracting and distracting with potentially disastrous consequences for something called scholarship. So it's this something called scholarship that I want to worry a bit about right now, because it seems to me, in her argument at least, it's a little bit too fixed, too essential, too eternal a notion. And she suggests we're taking it for granted quite badly, and while we all obsess about our ebooks and our apps and our blogging and multimodality seems to be the latest thing, we're sort of taking all this scholarship for granted, and something quite sinister is happening, which is the system that supports humanistic knowledge itself is at risk, so she claims. So I have a number of questions about these assertions, and the first and foremost, of course, is at least an apparent essentialization of scholarship as something that is arduous and serious and takes place over your entire life and is founded on expertise and professionalism. And, you know, I get it. I think in the context of academic capitalism, in the context of so much TED thinking is something I nicked from Umair Haque in his piece, Harvard Business Review. It's very good. Let's save great ideas from the ideas industry, yay. He's actually not having a go at TED Talks for who would dare do such a thing. We all love hate them, don't we? TED thinking is shorthand for reductionism, instrumentalism. technicism ad absurdum. The bottom paragraph pretty much says it in the first sentence. TED thinking assumes complex social problems are essentially engineering challenges. It does indeed. So in the face of all this, I get a kind of preservational approach to scholarship. I think it's understandable. I think it's too reactionary. And I'm not sure that we should, and I'm not sure that we can preserve what is effectively a very conservative idea, and it is an idea of scholarship, which, as Janneke Adema's work shows, I think very well, is founded and kind of embedded in the print book, in the elite university, and also, and something I'll come back to in a bit, the hugely normative figure of the scholar, which is pretty much up for grabs, I think, at the moment. In any case, when it comes to risk, what's this risk business? Until very recently in my life, I have totally elided the management approach to risk in favour of something far more mischievous and activist and kind of attuned to Rosie Braidotti's incitements to bad behaviour of various kinds and conceptual risk-taking. So I'm kind of, more on that track. Basically, the problem with crisis models, including of publishing and the humanities and scholarship, is that they produce conservative reactions. And I see a lot of both of those things in this research that Janneke mentioned on for CREATE, which is on copyright reform in the creative industries, particularly in my case in the context of publishing. So there's CREATE, it's a centre, it's a really large conglomerate for universities and projects, Centre for Creativity, Regulation, Enterprise and Technology, and here I am in theme 4, down the list somewhere, doing stuff on whose book is it anyway, IP, collaborative business models, and questions of ethics and creativity in digital publishing. This research that we do on this, I work with Janice Jeffries, is, I like to think, scholarly, but it certainly isn't founded in expertise or professionalism. I write about copyright. I'm not a copyright lawyer. I do research on publishing, and I was not until very recently, and probably am not yet, a publisher. But, there's a legitimate investment here, which is a political investment, intellectual investment in the future of academic publishing and the future of academic writing. In fact, I'm about to write a paper on this, the one that Janneke mentioned, which will effectively argue that we should de-legalise the debate on copyright, which sounds a bit odd, but I think that's probably what we need to do if we're going to have a sensible conversation about the underlying politics of communication and the possibilities, such as they are, of opening out writing and academic scholarship in the context of digital publishing. So my intervention here, and in other contexts, I think is founded on being able to identify two very different kinds of temporality. And the problem with crisis models is that they have a kind of from-to temporality. We move from this thing to this thing. It's progressive inherently, it's deterministic, it's preferred by government, it's preferred by industry, it's preferred within this larger, more pervasive market-led rationality, of course. So I think when Joanna Drucker picks up the crisis model in order to criticise the move from print to digital as an innovation of an illusion of innovation, I think she just makes a mistake that's very easy to make, which is you pick up the crisis model, you pick up its temporality, and it's not helpful, ultimately. So away from that, my more kind of political, intellectual investments, this activism, this mischief-making is focused on two projects right now that I'm hoping at some point will come together. The first one is my second novel, which seemed to be a very bad idea at the time, but it's too late now. It's a bit like my first novel, which, there it is, Optical Effects of Lightning. It is intended to work, at least intended to work, as fiction while kind of constituting a mode, a method, a way of doing and a way of making new media studies, science and technology studies. The new one, I have to say, I'm only a sixth of the way through, roughly. So I don't have anything to show you, really, at this. What I might do is put the first chapter up on the wiki, and we'll see how that goes. But it's called A Day in the Life of Janet Smart. It's turning out to be quite a day. It's a feminist critique of smart media and smart technologies and the temporalities of smart media and smart technologies. It will, in ways I really haven't figured out yet, intersect with a mid-length digital print-on-demand academic monograph called iMedia, The Gendering of Objects, Environments and Smart Materials, which, when I actually start it, will be written in various forms of the manifesto. The publishers have asked me to think about a series on gender, on new technologies and new media. Simultaneously asked me who, what, where their main competition was these days. My answer to that question has something to do with this other project, which is the one a lot of you know about, which involves kind of trying to set up a digital-first academic publishing house at the Goldsmiths Press. Plans for this, I have to say, are at a critical juncture, which is basically the endless resubmission of business plans. A little note on my business plan was, by the way, this is to management, a digital-first academic publisher is not the same thing as a digital-only academic publisher. This is helpful information. Business plans I've discovered have to have a long list of risks attached to them, have to have a long list of alternatives attached to them. It was in the business plan that I learnt to speak the language of risk management, of course, as you would assume. Under alternatives to setting up the Goldsmiths Press, do nothing. Do a digital-only publisher. Do a print-only publisher. It sounds odd to say that now. Digital-only publishing, some of you will disagree. I think it's widely said it's got ahead of the market. It probably is the outcome of a little bit too much pixel dust, to use Drucker's title. Probably doesn't take enough account of the continuities between print and digital publishing. Print-only publishing, when you say it, it sounds like an anachronism, and yet we look around us and traditional publishers in academia and trade make very little use of digital affordance, very, very little use of the digital environment. So if we are saying, and clearly we are, and we have been for some time, that hybrid publishing is the way forward, I think we need to worry a little bit more about what that means. Hybrid publishing means analog digital, but I think for me too it means something to do with the way in which we combine traditional and non-traditional writing and publishing. Nevertheless, the thing I like most about hybrid publishing is that it messes up crisis models. So I've only been sort of involved in this area for a little while, but in that time I've said quite a lot about why we should avoid what I call false dichotomies in the way that we talk about publishing. Because I think they structure what we say, because I think that they delimit what we are able to say, and of course one of the founding dichotomies would be print-digital divide, which is not helpful. An opposition for me between fluid and fixed books is not that helpful, and for me also closed and open access doesn't really work. I know a lot of you disagree, but the open access debate for me is top-heavy, is ideological, is policy-driven, here in the UK at least. It does proffer a business model, for sure. I worry about that business model when it relies on article or author processing charges. In the context of the UK, I think all of that means the preferred route is gold open access with article/author processing charges. What that actually means for me is effectively a way of streamlining what's done, the research that gets done in the arts, in the humanities, and in the social sciences. So it's extraordinarily pernicious on that level. Nevertheless, the Goldsmiths Press will be, and will not be, an open access publisher, meaning that, yes, of course, it will try and incorporate principles of the open access movement, the more bottom-up stuff, combining accessible, free, where possible, content with hopefully a fair, definitely a varied pricing scheme designed to keep our heads above water. Kind of have to say that to college, who are funding this and make us sustainable, but also designed to try and avoid exploiting either the readers, users, consumers, or the producers, creators, authors of content, clearly. So part of my thinking behind the press really was trying to sift this notion of open from the notion of ethical in publishing. Ethics is really interesting, and I know Andre knows a lot more about it in the context of mattering press, but it takes you in the direction, I guess, of thinking more about process, publishing relations, very positive direction to think in. Probably now I would want to be a bit more cautious than I have been and that other people have been in avoiding another split, another dichotomy, in this case between the objects, the artifacts of publishing the books, etc., the apps, whatever it's going to be, and the processes involved in publishing, the entities, if you like, and the relations. I don't think it's necessarily helpful to split those things either. So one of the things, so ethical publishing and open access publishing for me are slightly separate things, but they're often related in practice. One of the things that goes on here with Mattering Press, with OHP, with Goldsmiths Press, is a desire to look again at the scholarly practices that underpin humanities that was fundamentally always or absolutely never in crisis, that's kind of disrupted, that's deconstructed, not by the digital, not by any from to temporality, but by an ongoing, long-standing process of engaging and coming up against and absorbing and in a philosophical speech, becoming with whatever it is that the humanities isn't, basically. And the scholarly practices that underpin the humanities are no more or less stable, yes, than the humanities. But of course they are stabilized. They're normalized, they're performed, they're ritualized. They're increasingly indicative of the viral spread of audit culture within the sort of body of the academy, as we know. Fundamentally, for me, the ultimate division is Bergson's split of time and space, which for me gives off to an unhelpful, very common division between what's vital and creative and what's instrumental, or what's experimental, and what's institutional and institutionalized. I just came across this very good piece, by the way, in the journal Differences, it's a recent edition, by Mark Garrett Cooper and John Marks, called Crisis, 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 Big Media and the Humanities Workforce, which is, it was arguing something very similar about, how actually, we can regard institutionalization of scholarship as a form of experimentation. So in other words, let's not make those divisions. It's only really where they come together, all these things, yeah? Where cuts are made, where stabilizations occur, where instrumentalities are found, that we get the chance to come in, that we get the chance to intervene. And so, in other words, I guess scholarship for me is a vital thing, and it's an instrumental thing. It's fundamentally institutional, and it's also fundamentally experimental. We cannot free it, liberate it, reform it, transform it, but we can probably instrumentalize it or institutionalize it a bit better. And what that means for me, doing it better, is in a Haraway phrase, staying with the trouble of academic capitalism, of not sort of doing what Joanna Drucker ultimately does, which is take an ahistorical approach to scholarship and remove it from the contemporary neoliberal academy and try and keep it preserved and untouched. I think it's actually more responsible and probably more politically efficacious to deal with the relationship between scholarship and academic capitalism. This transformation of knowledge to the terms of productivity. So this is where Gary comes in. In the introduction to Digitize Me, on the limits of openness, so Gary Hall points out that this transformation of knowledge to productivity, signaled by Lyotard, of course, as symptomatic of the postmodern condition, leads us to all of this emphasis on performance, openness, transparency, efficiency, accountability. The discourses then, the practices, the techniques of finance, audits, metrics, citation indices. These are widely and rightly being said to govern academic life now. But yeah, here comes the kind of feminist Foucauldian stuff again, right? What of differences in gender and other differences in and amongst all this governability? And this is where the Goldsmiths Press will take a lead from an international feminist collective, some of you may have heard of, called Fembot. Fembot produces an online, open access, non-APC journal called ADA, the Journal of Gender, New Media and Technology. Not surprisingly, Fembot is attuned to gender differences in the increasing demand for free labour and in relationship to peer review practices and in relation to citation practices. By the way, this issue 4, just coming out fairly soon, will deal completely with those sorts of gender differences in scholarly practice, so it's worth having a look. Fembot is also concerned with the differences between earlier and more established career academics. So where, junior academics or early career academics are, I would still say, in the front line of a really big change in the subject positioning or self-positioning of the academic or the scholar entrepreneur, which I think probably is the grim reality. Scholar entrepreneur. Isn't that the grim reality of these new hybrid practitioners? We are very, very, very tempted to celebrate otherwise. And this poor person is urged, and I have heard many anecdotes to this effect, to engage in what a colleague of mine described as spectacular displays of productivity, embodying the persona, the practices of the kind of lone, library-bound, dusty, default, masculine intellectual with media-savvy, media-trained, blogging, tweeting, podcasting, celebrity, PR person, right? What I most appreciate, actually, about the Joanna Drucker piece is the way she exposes all tech-only solutions, including the ones we like at the moment. Not the blogging, not the podcasting so much, but the multimodality, for instance. She exposes that as part of a tech-only solution to the so-called crisis in academic publishing, which, it kind of caught me out a little bit. It's very likely that I'll be editing an issue of Ada on multimodality, so I was thinking, okay. Goldsmiths Press will be linked to Goldsmiths iTunes U, will be linked to our podcasting service. We'll seek out forms and formats suited to our specialisms in visual and media arts. You can see the problem. At the same time, we'll probably likely co-publish, a series of books that's precisely directed against TED thinking, against the kind of rationality behind TED thinking, the reductionist, the technicist stuff. So ultimately, I agree with Joanna Drucker. There are no tech-only solutions in academic publishing. And this is not about from to crises. It's about something much more insidious, much more naturalized, these entrenchments, these extensions of instrumentalization, masculinization, and marketization. The poor do-it-all scholar entrepreneur, that's you and me as well, I think. This exercises me a lot. There are very few options, I think, for communication. If we accept that the place that they are coming from is a research monograph, is the article, is the book chapter, and the place that we're allegedly going to is the TED Talk. Okay? So the point of the press, Goldsmiths Press, isn't to join the innovation bandwagon in publishing, or it will be a side effect. The point is to intervene by at least striving to keep open. It's the striving thing that will matter. The politics of communication, the politics of knowledge, in a context in which these are always being shut down. It's not new, it's not just digital, they've always been being. It's one of the central paradoxes of change in the creative or cultural industries, in media technologies, in communication technologies, in biotechnologies. The more the possibilities for change open out, the more they are kind of, in a sense, proportionately shut down. It's a dynamic. We will try and at least redirect a little bit of free labour here and there, including mine, because I do currently edit 2 mainstream academic journals. On the techniques and technologies of regulation, I think probably be more attuned to differences than to sort of seeking to make transparent practices of peer review and citation. Of course, a new press will reconstitute ideas about utility, reconstitute ideas about auditability. It will feed the ref, amongst other such monsters. But it'll also try and make it sick, ill, slightly off colour, create some possibilities for fault lines and failures amongst auditability and utility. And that's quite simple, actually. It's about a long tradition, a fine tradition of publishing stuff that messes up the boundaries of arts and humanities and social sciences and creates just a little bit of space for the poor scholar entrepreneur to play. So just to finish, the play thing is serious with Haraway on that one. Play is serious. It's also serious business because I'm a feminist scholar entrepreneur, right? Play is gendered for me. It's manifestly not sort of founded on what one of my favourite feminist thinkers calls this frightful masculine fashion of speaking in order to be right. Brackets, how ridiculous. So play is serious, it's gendered. Its mode for me is writing. Writing understood by Derrida to significantly exceed the word, understood by Foucault to not equal freedom, alas, what a shame. And writing elevated by Donna Haraway, not least in the Cyborg Manifesto, as the ultimate technique of reworlding, of repurposing where we're at. Okay, I think that's me done.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Just going to introduce Andrea now for you. So Andrea Dagny is the co-founder and co-editor of Mattering Press, and he's a postdoctoral research fellow at the Department of Sociology at the Goethe University in Frankfurt am Main. And prior to this, Andrea was a doctoral researcher at the Department of Sociology at Lancaster University. Inspired by science and technology studies, his PhD thesis was a material semiotic analysis of liberal democracy through the Hungarian parliament building. Andrea's current research focuses on three themes: the role of numbers in democratic politics, the ways in which bodies become political, and the politics of knowledge-making practices in science and technology studies. And you can find out more about Mattering Press at matteringpress.org. I'm just going to put your presentation on.
Excellent. Thanks a lot. Can you hear me now? Yeah. So thanks so much, Gary and Janneke, for organizing this and inviting me. It's a great privilege to be here, and I'm very much excited about the discussions today and the subsequent seminars. What I'm going to talk about today, I think, will resonate in very interesting ways with both Sarah's talk and also with Gary and Janneke's paper about the artist books. I think there are very interesting parallels there. But let me start with Mattering Press. So the term mattering, and I need to click. The term mattering comes from science and technology studies. Probably many of you know that this is a heterogeneous field that brings together sociologists, social anthropologists, human geographers, cultural economists, and many others with the aim of problematizing science's self-understanding as a set of disembedded and disembodied practices. They usually do this problematization by making the actual places and the actual practices of knowledge-making more visible. The field itself was established in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when the first ethnographic studies of some Western European and North American laboratories were published. And since then, STS scholars have extended their gaze to various other sites, from hospitals through high-tech innovation centers to stock exchange trading rooms, in order to explore how scientific knowledge is being produced and distributed through seemingly trivial material practices, and how it can be produced and distributed differently. Ironically, what's largely missing from the list of usual STS sites are the institutions that play one of the most important roles in shaping the academic world STS scholars themselves operate in, namely publishers. So to address this hiatus, Mattering Press was established in 2012 by a small group of young scholars to better understand current developments in academic publishing by actively participating in them. As I said in the beginning, we are an open access publisher. We publish peer-reviewed books, or we will publish peer-reviewed books, empirically grounded monographs and edited collections of various formats. Hopefully the first publications will come out in the end of this year. This is a small group of people, and everyone, although we all come from STS, everyone has his or her own interest in this project. Mine is politics. So what I'm going to talk about today is what I call the politics of self-publishing. In this short presentation, I will articulate what this might mean using the illegal or samizdat publishing in the 1970s and 1980s in communist Hungary. First, I will briefly recount the history of samizdat production in Central and Eastern Europe in general and Hungary in particular. And then, drawing on the insights of samizdat research, I will identify 3 dimensions of self-publishing: materiality, experimentation, and the ethics of openness. And finally, referring to a couple of STS scholars, I will discuss how these 3 dimensions might be simultaneously captured by the term mattering and how they might be reflected in our own publishing practices. So this is what I have to offer today. And so first I will start with samizdat histories. The term samizdat was coined by the Russian poet Nikolai Glaskov in the early 1950s, and it means self-publishing. It refers to both to the various processes of producing texts unauthorized by the state and to the outcomes of those processes, mostly literary and political writings that could not have appeared in official periodicals. In the Soviet Union, until the mid-1950s, samizdat activities were limited to circulating handwritten manuscripts or a few copies of uncensored typescripts among friends and colleagues. It was only a few years after Stalin's death when a wider group of people began to reproduce and pass on uncensored writings, sometimes even without the author's consent. From the late 1950s onwards, some illegally published journals and books, such as less-known works of Bulgakov, Pasternak, and Solzhenitsyn, could reach much wider readership, often by getting Western publishing houses involved in the production process. So what you see here is the original typescript of Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, and pay particular attention to the materiality of this object. The relative success of literary samizdat in the Soviet Union was followed by the gradual appearance of more explicit political writings, such as open letters, appeals, even manifestos. Perhaps the most important periodical of this kind was the Chronicle of Current Events, which regularly contained reports on violations of human rights. So here's a typescript of an issue of the Chronicle. According to estimates, the circulation of the Chronicle was between 1,000 and 10,000, with the readership between 10,000 and 100,000. As the number of copies of illegally published texts kept increasing, those who were writing, distributing, or even reading samizdat risked constant harassment by the secret police. In order to prevent imprisonment and confiscation of manuscripts and printing technologies, dissidents formed various networks in which sensitive information, printed texts, money, and other objects could be transmitted in an anonymous manner. Outside the Soviet Union, samizdat activities in one form or another existed in many Central and Eastern European countries. The history of Hungarian samizdat began in the late 1960s, although some illegally published poems and novels had been around since the early 1950s. Initially, this was much more of an artistic ambition rather than an explicitly political mission. One of the most exciting places where avant-garde artists, political philosophers, and other groups labeled as deviant by communist authorities could gather to experiment with new forms of expression was a chapel at Balatonboglár. Balaton is a lake not very far from Budapest. Each summer between 1970 and 1974, dozens of people moved into the chapel and the surrounding field for a few weeks to present their art or theoretical work. These summer events were more than simply occasions to meet like-minded people. As one of the action artists put it, these performances were punishment preventive orthotherapies. So here you can see a performance artist engaging in a punishment preventive orthotherapy. The lectures presented and artworks exhibited at the chapel often conveyed serious political messages, which consequently led to the official closure of the chapel in 1974 and to the forced immigration or arrest of many of the artists. After Balatonboglár, it proved to be difficult to keep different strands of alternative artists and political troublemakers together. It was only in the 1980s, early 1980s, that a number of illegal publishing houses could be established in Hungary. Some publishers commissioned essays on taboo topics, such as the 1956 revolution or the everyday struggles of Hungarian minorities in neighboring countries. So these are some of the covers of illegally published text. The bottom left is a book about the 1956 revolution. The top left, the title is The Aesthetics of Censorship. Yeah. Other publishers debuted with works of banned authors such as Arthur Koestler or George Orwell. As a result of gradual institutionalization of samizdat production, in 1981, the first issue of the most influential samizdat periodical, the quarterly Beszélő, appeared in about 1,000 copies, followed by a circulation of 2,000 for subsequent issues. The aim of the founder editors of these publishing houses and periodicals was, in their own words, to create a parallel or a second society where any political topic could be discussed openly. So, okay, this was my kind of brief history of samizdat in Central Europe and in Hungary, and now I'm going to talk about what I consider to be the three dimensions of self-publishing, starting with materiality. So according to the dominant view in samizdat research, the aim of illegally published texts was to report the real conditions in communist societies, to transmit the truth suppressed in the official world of state-censored publications. Probably this view explains why most researchers concentrate exclusively on the content of samizdat texts. However, the content and the material existence of samizdat texts can hardly be analyzed independent of each other. To quote the literary scholar N. Komáromi, the amateur typescript, the deformity of the text, the characteristic mistakes, corrections, fragile paper, and the degraded print quality had value because they marked the difference between samizdat and official publications. Moreover, building upon Jacques Derrida's concept of the written trace, Komáromi argues that there was an element of ambiguity in the relationship between the physical form and the idealized content. Unlike officially published texts, samizdat articles were constantly modified by copyists, while authors had practically no control over the life of their own writings. In many cases, the message central to mainstream samizdat research existed in so many versions that it became of secondary importance compared to the symbolic value of the text object itself. Seen this way, samizdat in the Eastern Bloc can be considered as a distinctive text object, the result of a complicated process that required the cooperation of a whole range of actors, including authors, typewriters, editors, graphic designers, low-tech or occasionally high-tech printing devices, distributors with vans, and so on. It was also the beginning of subsequent processes in which periodicals and books got borrowed, secretly photocopied, collected, read and discussed, and no doubt analyzed by the authorities. Such processes in samizdat research are usually discussed as particular forms of resistance associated with the subordinate or the powerless. In an essay entitled The Terrifying Mimicry of Samizdat, another literary scholar, Sergei Ushakin, criticizes this understanding of resistance located in places outside of the fields of power. Through the analysis of illegal publishing in the Soviet Union between the late 1960s and the late 1970s, Ushakin argues that the topics and the ways in which dissidents discussed them were largely framed by existing public discourses on Soviet law and civic and human rights. In other words, he claims that those involved in samizdat publishing mimicked and thus actively experimented with dominant political order. So here's a quote from him. Dissidents question not so much the principles of the existing political order, but rather their implementation. For the majority, the issue was not whether socialism was feasible at all. It was too real to have any doubts about its existence. Instead, to quote the title of an influential samizdat article, the main question was, is a non-totalitarian type of socialism possible? Historically speaking, the answer seems to be no. In 1989, 1990, the state socialist regimes in Central and Eastern Europe gradually fell apart. The democratic transition made not only the institution of state censorship obsolete, but also the established practices of illegal publishing. In fact, the only places where samizdat can be found these days are temporary exhibitions and specialized archives, for example, the collection of the Open Society archives in Budapest. Located in these institutions, the once illegally published texts serve as obligatory passage points for historians interested in the collapse of communism, but are considered to have no relevance whatsoever to contemporary politics. But is this right? Recent uses of samizdat as a term suggest otherwise. According to the jargon file, which is a comprehensive compendium of hacker slang, samizdat originally referred to underground duplication and distribution of banned books in the Soviet Union, now refers by obvious extension to any less than official promulgation of textual material, especially rare, obsolete, or never formally published computer documentation. Samizdat is obviously much easier when one has access to high bandwidth networks and high quality laser printers. End of quote. So given this kind of afterlife of samizdat, it's not surprising that there's a collaborative tool called samizdat that can be used to publish websites. So this is an application called samizdat. Samizdat is a generic RDF-based engine for building collaboration and open publishing websites. Samizdat provides users with means to cooperate and coordinate on all kinds of activities, including media activism, resource sharing, education and research, advocacy, and so on. Samizdat intends to promote values of freedom, openness, equality, and cooperation. Samizdat's open and transparent nature and its multilingual capabilities make it an excellent solution for international and political projects. End of quote. And finally, you will be very happy to hear that there are a number of open access book publishers that use the term, like Samiz.press and Samiz.express. So there are more examples, and they are obviously different from each other, but what seems to connect them is a specific ethics of openness. So these were the three dimensions I wanted to highlight, and now I will say a few words about mattering. Because I think the term mattering very nicely captures, in a way, all three dimensions, but not without adding a certain twist to them. So let me briefly go through them again and qualify them with three quotes from Science and Technology Studies. So the first meaning of mattering is associated with materiality. As we've seen in the case of Samizdat publishing, the materiality of the texts had played an important role in establishing the truth value of those texts. In our case, this is clearly not the situation. In fact, our aim is to produce as beautiful and professional looking texts as possible. So mattering for us is to make visible how such texts come about. And to use Susan Lee Starr's words, mattering in this sense is to take on the erasing process as the central human behavior of concern, and then to track that comparatively across domains. This is, in the end, a profoundly political process, since so many forms of social control rely on the erasure or silencing of various workers, on deleting their work from the representations of work. So in very practical terms, we place a great emphasis on, when we produce books, to indicate or make visible all the work that goes into the making of it. Authors are important, editors are important, but so are proofreaders and designers and a whole bunch of other people. So I think this is an important thing that is not just a gesture, but also a political intervention. The second meaning of mattering has to do with experimentation. In the case of Samizdat publishing, this term was used to place those involved in illegal publishing not in direct opposition to a singular regime, but to put them in a position from where experimentation with various aspects of that regime became possible. So just as the aim of Samizdat publishing was not to bring down state socialism, mattering is not against current forms of commercial or academic publishing as such. It proposes not so much a new definition of truth as a method of experimentation or a construction for new truth. To experiment is to consider theory as a creative practice. This is why it is no longer a question of knowing what is true, but how truth comes about. So this is a quote by William James, quoted by Isabel Stengers in her book on Whitehead. Sorry, this is just having fun. Again, in practical terms, We are all for experimentation, but we don't think that this is a general scheme. In fact, I think it's very important to figure out what an experiment is or what it's all about in a series of dialogues with authors. So what is experimental for them, and why is it important to do it this way and not in others? And finally, the third meaning of mattering has an ethical component. In the case of Samizdat publishing, this ethics was and still is defined primarily in terms of openness. However, making things open is only half of the story. The other half is to keep things open, which requires what Anne-Marie Moll, a Dutch philosopher, calls care. So mattering, in this sense, is a process. It does not have clear boundaries. It is open-ended. This is not a matter of size. It does not mean that a care process is larger, more encompassing than the devices and activities that are part of it. Instead, it is a matter of time. For care is not a small or large product that changes hands, but a matter of various hands working together over time towards a result. Care is not a transaction in which something is exchanged, a product against a price, but an interaction in which the action goes back and forth in an ongoing process. So this is the end of the quote. Again, in practical terms, in Mattering Press, we are very much interested in getting readers and a smaller collective of academics involved already in the making of the book. And also we are experimenting with open reviews. So peer review, but the reviewers are in an ongoing conversation with the authors. Again, I'm happy to tell you more about this maybe in the discussion. I think I will end here. Thanks a lot.
We've got Greg Saper here on Skype, and he's gonna use this Screen Hero software to kind of navigate his own presentation, so let's hope that all goes well. So Greg Saper is professor and director of the Language, Literacy and Culture PhD program at UMBC in Baltimore, Maryland, US. And he's the author of Intimate Bureaucracies, 2012, Networked Art, 2001, and Artificial Mythologies, 1997. And he has edited or co-edited volumes on Post-humanist, 2010, Imagining Place, 2009, and Drifts, 2007. He has published widely on fluxes and visual poetry and serves as the reviews editor and blog report columnist for Rhizomes. His curatorial projects include exhibits on Assemblings, 1997, Noir Concrete Poetry in Brazil, 1998, and Typebound, 2008, as well as folkfind.org, 2003 till 2006. In addition, he has published 2 other pamphlets on Being Read, 1985, and Raw Material, 2008, as well as an edition of Bob Brown's Words, 2010, and Readies, 2010. Saper is presently writing a biography of the poet, publisher, impresario, writer in every imaginable genre, Bob Brown, who invented an avant-garde reading machine. The simulation of the reading machine can be found at Saper's website, which is readies.org. Greg, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Apology for the. Do they hear the echo? No. Good. So I can see how I fit quite nicely with this panel so far, because my scholarship began with a study of Samizdat books and publishing in not only locally but also internationally with the word that was used at the time called assemblings. And what it led to was an interest that continues today in alternative forms of publishing and alternative models of infrastructure in academia. So I wanted to begin, though, by shifting gears a little bit and showing you a clip.
An Our Foundation manages an anonymous and confidential telephone line to attend children and teenagers under a risk situation. As a result of International Day Against Child Abuse, we launch a message for those once suffering any kind of abuse. A message exclusively for them, hidden from adults' eyes. The outdoor uses a lenticular to assemble two images, the one aimed at adults and the other aimed at children. The lenticular allows you to see one image from one angle and a different image from another angle. From the average height by age, we can determine what part of each image will be seen by each person. In this way, we find an area only visible by children under 10. A message only for children. And a warning for adults.
In any case, what I'm trying to show there is two things. One is an example of social media activism, and part of a Spanish organization called Aid to Children and Adolescents at Risk Foundation. But more importantly, I'm trying to show an example of paradoxically targeted and multiple messages at the same time. So what I'm trying to demonstrate there in that clip is the idea of that we can send out messages into a larger public audience, but that we can also simultaneously target those messages to individual audiences. So it's one of the conflicts, I think, that we've seen and talked about earlier in the panel in terms of how are we going to create public activist scholarship. And so this might be one way, if we think about this in terms of a metaphor and not simply the literal billboard strategy. I'm going to try to go forward. Should I click it again? No. And now I should play?
He should play on its own.
Okay. So although this is, a very important issue in the social realm in the United States, the Trayvon Martin case, where he was shot by a vigilante, and the vigilante wasn't charged with murder. So this is talking about how the media picked it up, and it's very popular in terms of the mass media have picked up these studies to look at how the media responded to this controversy and what dates and what happened at which times. But in fact, this is rather an example of a conservative move in the digital humanities, which is usually thought of in terms of a restricted concordance style of research and instances of a media story that is then visualized and charted. So when we think of digital humanities scholarship, at least in the United States, this is what we think of first. This kind of visualization, what I call the small tent or narrow focus digital humanities. Valuable, but it doesn't really move us beyond a kind of traditional notion of what the humanities are doing. That is, it's very much about a fixed notion of the humanities. So as Sarah said earlier in the panel, there might be an alternative to this, which would be rethinking the notion of what the humanities are essentially. That is not necessarily a fixed and a fixing of meanings, but rather something else, which I'm going to talk about here. So let's see if this works. So, I've put together, Sarah earlier today rightly sort of pointed out that this term multimodal has now become the new mana word of scholarship. Nevertheless, I've switched over to that word rather than digital humanities, which seem to be problematic. And so basically, these are the arguments that I have with administrators in the humanities, especially, but throughout the university. So as soon as we start thinking about alternative forms of scholarship, We also have to start thinking about how do we convince administrators and infrastructural administrators that this is something that is valuable. So the first one is simply to frame the argument in terms of bigotry, prejudice against anything that's not printed on paper, and that rather no longer privileging that one mode of delivery over all others. And this is a huge argument among administrators. I mean, they're like still wanting to have something they can hold in their hand. The other is that major scholarly organizations, associations are already beginning to pick up this mantle. So the Modern Language Association now in their bibliographic guidelines mention that you need to put the word print after a book in a bibliography that is printed. So that is, it's not privileging that form, but it's rather thinking of that form as exceptional. And that was in 2007, but these things take time in academia. Finally, then, that it makes available new tools, perspectives, and types of knowledge. And what I'm interested in is that third one, the types of knowledge. Administrators, being instrumentalists, are interested in the new tools, basically. That is, they want to buy equipment. They want to know what the new tools are. The multimodal book equivalents are still part of the history of the book and printing. So, I mean, again, when I talk to administrators, one of the things that I've tried to explain is that why social media scholarship, which could be the next mana word or mana phrase that we'll begin to use, that is simply wider access to and dissemination of information. Politicians love that sort of thing. New potential to manage, mine, map, and remix data and materials, the transformation of scholarship, the enhancement and innovation in teaching, learning, and thinking, increased public impact, awareness, engagement, and support. So again, this is in my trajectory, what I became interested in is all forms of publication. So the first experiment I did, whoops, we went too far. Should I just let it, should I try to go back?
You can let it play because it'll be silent.
So I'm just going to let this play. It's a film, a reading of Danielewski's Only Revolutions, and it's a film about the reading process. And so what I became interested in is how will reading itself change to correspond to So in any case, what I became interested in was the notion of reading itself and how reading will change in response to these new forms or multimodal forms of publication. And that process of reading will be remediated back into the way that we read traditional books. So because of that, I began to publish books that were about the reading process. And I think this is really an exciting area that we really haven't begun to think about. That much of the focus has been on writing, on publishing. But what we might be thinking about is that reading itself as a mechanical process is going to change. So as part of that, what we tried to do was to think about how publishing could respond to new reading practices. So although we think of reading as being simply a matter of responding to the print literacy mode, what if reading was going to lead the way in new forms of publishing? That is, that as the new reading methods evolve, we're going to have to respond after the curve with new forms of publication. And so you can see here in this example that reading is going to respond in radically different ways to the book itself, but also because of the various different multimodalities that we're now running as an experiment in our culture, that publishing will have to respond to that as well. And so I first did some experiments where I simply published one book with 3 different publishers. One of them gave away the book free online. One of them sold the book as part of a series called Minor Compositions, which was Autonomedia publisher. And he basically just goes to book fairs and sells the books there. You probably know him. In any case, the third one was AK Press, which is an anarchist press that publishes political work. But what I did as an experiment is, instead of thinking of the writing as simply the content of the book, I thought of the publication process itself as part of the writing process. So the writing process was, in that book called Intimate Bureaucracies, was as much about dealing with 3 different publishers to publish one little pamphlet. So the idea there was that infrastructure could become a kind of poetry, or what I've called in the past sociopoetics. But I'm interested now in what I'm going to call infrastructuralism, a kind of parody or play on structuralism, but now thinking of creation of infrastructure as a kind of form of poetry. So we've heard about conceptual poetry, language poetry, flarf, etc. But what I'm interested in is the poetry of infrastructure, which has allusions to Marx, but also to a kind of sociopoetics, Joseph Beuys, for example. And in one of those experiments, then, I published this small little pamphlet with these 3 different publishers.
Come and walk through the Folkvine site and see how it's grown from the seed of an idea to an organically growing garden of sites featuring artists, communities, and scholars. In 2002, 2 professors wanted to find a new way to present research on Florida folklife to a wider international audience. They sought to conserve and document folklife and to translate scholarship into interactive media online. This was the beginning of the Folkvine Project.
In 2002, I met Kristen Congdon, and she explained to me that the culture of Central Florida was often misunderstood. It was often thought about in terms of theme parks, and instead, we should think about it in terms of the rich cultural traditions in this area.
I've been doing research on folk art for 30 years, and I came to Florida in 1988 and started researching about Florida folk artists. And I found so many amazing people that when I met Craig Saer, we decided together that we needed to do a website on some of these amazing people so that people could understand what it was like to visit with these extraordinary individuals.
Not everyone in the world can visit a folk artist at home in rural Florida, for example, but the surrounding communities, cultural heritage, and the processes involved in making art and building communities were crucial to our project. After building a team of scholars, artists, and students, the group set out to create this unique project, meeting and documenting these extraordinary artists.
The uniqueness of the Folkvine Project is that we don't just study the artists as an object of study, but we use their sensibility and their aesthetics and their community's traditions as a model for how we would represent them and how we would organize our website. So we began the project by going out in the countryside and other places in Central Florida and finding these folk traditions and these artists. And we began to talk about how we're going to translate that to an online experience. And one of the things that I work on is how scholarship changes when we move online. What are the advantages to moving online in terms of organization, in terms of design, in terms of visual and sonic effects?
Working on Folkvine raises a lot of different kinds of questions. It's very different from writing a book. One of the issues that we've had to deal with is about representation. How are we representing other people? Are we doing it in an ethical manner? We are also learning about ways to collaborate. It seems that when we bring a number of different kinds of people together, faculty, community artists, students, we're able to ask questions and do things that are much more expansive, much more complex, much more detailed than if we were working all alone.
Folkvine meetings are often about digging up ideas, looking for the metaphor that works for each artist. Once we hit on an idea, we work with the designer to help her make real the concept we've discussed. On Ginger Lavoie's site, for example, the physical caress of the fabric was so important that it was designed into her site. The mouse rolling over the image serves as a virtual caress. Every good garden needs a plan, paths to walk along, and a friendly, knowledgeable guide who knows the names of what's growing. At some point while we were growing Folkvine, we realized we needed just this: markers, paths, and guides to our site. Again, we worked to find a fitting metaphor, and we hit upon one that worked for all of us. Once we came up with it, it seemed obvious: a quirky roadside Florida visitor center, where you can pick up a tour guide to lead you through the content of the site, focusing on various humanities concepts. Or ask a bobblehead to give you his or her 2 cents.
Hi, I'm Craig Saper. You might have heard my name, but now you can see my bobblehead in action.
The direction that Folkvine took was influenced not only by the various folk artists' aesthetics, but also by the research interests of the team of faculty, artists, and students.
For me, as a folklorist, given that we're firmly entrenched in the digital age, the question becomes, how can we use new media in ways that involve rather than alienate the communities with whom we work?
Like all members of the folkvine.org team, my role in the project was very varied and flexible. I would move from one assignment to the other and fill many different roles. I sculpted the bobbleheads on the project, for example. The bobbleheads are a way that the academic voices can speak and explain different things from the project, and I sculpted the figures, sort of caricatures of the people who worked on the project.
The world is multicultural and multilingual. And the United States is multicultural and multilingual, and so is Florida. Therefore, it's logical that Folkvine also is multicultural and multilingual.
Text is unusual in the Folkvine website because we have complete flexibility in terms of how much text for a given artist site and the types of text that we can use, so that some of the sites have long passages of description or explanations of an artist's process or a long narrative about the artist's life, and other ones have brief, funny skits or verbal games that you can play, and we did that so that we could reflect the artist's sensibilities.
One of the most important things that we find our artists doing is drawing from their past, drawing from their homes to create a new home. Many of our artists are in Florida but have come from somewhere else, and what they're trying to do is bring together an aesthetic, a set of values, a set of concerns from another place, and bring them together with the ones that they have found in Florida here.
As an integral part of the Folkvine process, we held events in each of the artists' communities to present the websites and gather feedback. In this way, we cultivated a holistic relationship between the artists, their communities, and the website. Many thousands have participated in the websites online at folkvine.org, and we began to realize that although the world could not beat a path to these artists, we could open a window onto their worlds.
I did want to show you that one in part because my argument here today is that a real disruption to the humanities will have to happen at the level of the way that we produce text. That is, we won't produce PDFs. That doesn't really change the relationship to knowledge. Rather, what I'm interested in producing is what I'm calling visceral scholarship. That is multiple ways of approaching evidence and knowledge. But you can see in some ways, this project that you just looked at was very palatable. It wasn't, it didn't appear to be that radical in some ways. But in part, that was because we were community-based. We went out into the community and we worked with the artists to put their work to make it more accessible. But one of the things that's important here is that one of the first artists we looked at was a clown shoemaker. And the clown shoemaker was built miniature circuses. And if you go to folkfind.org and navigate through it, you can find his miniature circuses. Some of it's somewhat perverted, but fascinating for that reason. In any case, he built these miniature circuses and he did two strategies that we're borrowing. One is he did something called kit bashing. Kit bashing. And kit bashing is taking an existing model train figurine and breaking it or bashing it and then reformulating it into what you need it to do. So one of the things he would do at the time is he would collect little logos from the circuses, from candy wrappers, and then he would put those on the side of a train and other things like that. So in that way, that kind of, when he said to us what his strategy was, we immediately thought, oh my gosh, this is a better metaphor than even remixing, which doesn't really get at this notion that we're interested in, which is occupying a form that already exists and bashing it, kit bashing, to produce something else that's basically more fun or more whatever it is that you're going for, but using that strategy as the method of scholarship, kit bashing. The second thing that he said to us, and before I tell you what that second thing is, let me tell you that 2 weeks after we made the film of this particular circus clown that built the miniatures, he passed away, he died. So we didn't know that at the time, but it was this strange thing where somebody whose life is about trying to make people laugh was dying. In any case, what he said to us was, do not put this work in a museum. He said, I don't want it to be on 4 white walls. And we've heard that in art theory and in theoretical discussions about the 4 white walls and the sterilizing of art. And he told us right there, I mean, he looked at us and he said, this is what my legacy is. I don't want it to be in a museum. And there's a larger political conversation about that, which has to do with the Barnum family that gave a lot of money to a museum in Sarasota, Florida, which is a very conservative art museum. And they have white walls and unbelievable paintings on the walls. What he said was, I want it to be circusy. Circusy. And that made me think a lot about this idea of thinking about knowledge in relationship to the object of study. That is, we didn't look at these people as simply objects of study, but rather as giving us the model for how we would actually represent them. We would represent them using their own sensibility. And this is my major argument and really has informed my work since then, which is to rethink our relationship to the knowledge, to the objects that we are supposedly studying, as instead models for the form of the publication. So the way that the Folkfind looks is based on that notion. How do we make it look like we felt when we were interacting with these artists? And each one had a very different notion of that, and then we sort of put it all together into one. So that's my theoretical track, and I'm just going to sort of summarize quickly what we're doing now. So what we're doing now is we're looking at the most conservative bastion of publication, which is university press publications. And what we're doing here at this very small university, probably similar in some ways to Coventry, that is that we're not Harvard or Yale. And when I tell people my ambitions, they say to me, even the people here say to me, who the hell do you think you are? You'll never be able to compete against Harvard or Yale or Hopkins, which is also in Baltimore, Maryland. Why bother? And I think that's something I had to learn an answer to be honest with you. If you talk to administrators, they say things like that to you and you need to have an answer. In any case, what we're going to try to do is start a university press. And we're going to try to start a university press specifically for inextricably multimodal works, works that could never be produced in a PDF. Why? Because other people are doing the PDFs much better than we could ever do, including Hopkins. They run JSTOR, including Open Access Press. Everyone is able to do that better than us. But what we're interested in is something that could only be reproduced in a multimodal form. And we're working with Anvil Academics in the United States. And what we're doing is a series of projects that are also, so that's one side of it. The other side of it is community-based scholarship. Many of you probably know Baltimore from the TV show The Wire. And how many, just a show of hands, I'm just sort of curious, how many of you have seen The Wire? So, yeah, there you go. And so, I mean, we have this great burden. I mean, everyone thinks of that. And that actually, if you visit me here, I live not too far from that neighborhood, but it is one neighborhood, but Baltimore is a troubled place. But we're interested then in engaging Baltimore in community-based scholarship. So Baltimore is celebrating the end of the War of 1812, which ended in 1814. Because of that, there's a lot of interest in Baltimore itself. So some historians are doing work, and a number of people have projects looking at different communities, troubled, contested spaces in Baltimore. So our first publication will be this volume of multimodal works that are community-based about Baltimore. Anyway, I'm going to end it there, and I'm sorry for the technical difficulties, but hopefully we can recover. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Greg. For those of you who do still want to see Greg's fantastic presentation, it is up on the wiki already, so you can go, and if you have a good server, browser, whatever, it will probably load. So you can still see the videos, they're embedded there too, so you should be able to see it from there. And we're going to have Gary now, who's going to moderate this.
Special role. Had to include me. So we're going to have questions. We've got about 20-25 minutes or something like that, so we've got a little bit of time. I'm filling in now because every time everyone says, anyone got any questions, there's about 2 minutes of quietness where everyone looks at their shoes and they get into the swing of it. I'm kind of feeling really bad that we missed an opportunity. I mean, I thought calling it the Centre for Disruptive Media was kind of interesting in things, but if it would have been the Centre for Perverted Miniature Circuses, that would have been fantastic. I mean, it's what we're all doing, isn't it? We're all constructing a perverted miniature circus. So that would have been fantastic. So any questions?
Can I just start going back to one of the points that...
Oh, we have a mic. Thank you very much.
Start by going back to one of the points that Craig finished on, which is about your audience and who's going to...
Bit louder.
Who's it for? Who's going to read it?
Yeah.
Because I think that's quite important in terms of multimodal, or whatever your output is, however you produce your work, however you publish it. Within the arts, the world that I come from, everything starts with your audience and then gets driven from there. So I just wanted to kind of throw that back to you guys in terms of in terms of the kind of publishing that you're involved in and how you see your readership.
Yeah, I can answer that. Yeah, I was interested in what Craig was saying about that as well, and wanting to know about what were the changes in reading that led to, you know, reader-led changes. So it's a little, you know, it's kind of like what the kind of the mechanics of that, the differentiations among that. Would you say that the readership changes in a differentiated way? The older readers are more, you know, kind of dyed-in-the-wool academics are going to just want things the way they are. Thank you very much. You know, there's a lot of debate around that. And I guess the only other note of caution, I mean, not kind of closing down the answer, but I always think about the way in which, when we go back to critical theory, for example, with all that writing about writing and reading that happened with Barthes and Foucault and Derrida, and you know, I do this work a lot with my students, and then you kind of watch what happens. What happens is the shift happens between authors and readers, and there's this kind of clunky understanding of agency there that I would want to be a little bit cautious about. You know, the power was here, and now the power is over here. Is that really what happens?
Go on, Craig. You're fine.
Okay, good. You'll have to excuse me. How can I get some echo? We don't know. It's a little disconcerting because everything I'm saying has an echo, but it's okay. So I want to give two answers to that. The first is that in terms of the Folkvine project, we had multiple audiences. If you think back to that first slide or that first image that was playing in a very unusual way, but anyway, it was about how messages for child abuse need to reach a different audience depending on what the message has got to be different depending on the audience. And so in Folkvine, we had to reach distinct audiences. The first audience was the state was funding us. And I know that in the UK, you're dealing with this as well, is that the state cares a lot about making sure that their messages, their funding is not taken in a direction that would be displeasurable to the public. So we had to deal with that. And their mandate was, quote, make it accessible to the public. So to do that, what we did is we would show rough drafts of each of the segments of our website, each artist, and we would do that at a big giant event. So for example, we had a huge hula dance and event with food and performances and hula dancing and ukulele playing. When we talked about the quilt maker. And then we would take that information and we would try to modify the messages. So the notion of interaction is one aspect of this notion of reading. Yes, the second answer is that I'm now interested in looking at an avant-garde reading machine from the 1930s and late 20s that Gertrude Stein and Marcel Duchamp all participated in. That project is more along the lines of that notion of the critical theory, but it might have to do with a rethinking of reading as a kind of mechanical process. So what I'm interested in is a kind of, I don't know, the visceralness, the bodiliness, the erotics of reading itself as a physical activity rather than literacy. So much of my work in terms of reading is to sort of rethink reading away from literacy. And I'm in a department, I think you might have mentioned this at the very beginning, I'm in a department which is a doctoral program in literacy. So there's a kind of challenge there as well. I don't know if that just is the beginning of the answer. Obviously, I've been thinking about this for a bunch of years.
Andre?
Yeah, thanks. What I have to say is has something to do with two understandings of openness. So one understanding has something to do with numbers, and it's quite fascinating to think about, to relate back to the samizdat stories, that some of these books that were just incredibly difficult to produce and multiply and distribute sold, in the thousands or tens of thousands, and now we're happy when we sell, 500, 600, 700 copies of our academic books. And one argument for open access publishing is that it makes our works more accessible, so accessible to a wider audience. And I think that this is a compelling argument, but I would like to argue for a different understanding of openness, not something that works on the level of numbers, but something that, that relates to what in the paper version of my talk I call samizdat worlds. So basically, these spaces that are created around specific texts. So I think what is really interesting, if you open up the process of reading, and I think this resonates well also with what Craig just said, if you open up the process of reading, then you're able to think about the audience as members of a world centered around a book or particular texts. Which is more of an ongoing process, not just a one-off exchange. You buy the book, you read it, and then it's over.
Yeah, can I just, that notion of openness, I like that a lot. I'm going to think about that. That there's two opennesses. One is an openness of numbers, but then there's this other openness. I really like that idea. Thanks.
All the scholarship we've talked about has depended on publishing and printing. What about oral scholarship? How do we capture all of that analysis and knowledge and scholarship that isn't printed and promoted in traditional means or digital means?
So should I give that?
I was working obviously with folklorists, and we dealt with oral cultural traditions, and I don't really see a divide, much like Sarah talked about. I don't really see a divide, or Johanna Drucker talked about in that review. I don't see a huge divide between the digital and the oral cultural traditions. Rather, we looked at it as a way of sharing that oral cultural traditions. We would go to these events and film them. Yes, you're seeing a video of those things, but we're trying to break down the barrier between oral cultural traditions and print media. Again, I think publishing is long ago doesn't really necessarily just need print, is sort of the major point of my argument here. And that specifically, it hurts when you're dealing with something like oral cultures, like painters, like sound artists, etc. Those all benefit from being able to publish those in a different form. So hopefully it's clear that what I'm saying is the PDF is limited. That doesn't seem to be the only way to do digital work.
Okay, so to give a very specific example or answer to your question, one of the books that will be published by Mattering Press, hopefully in the end of this year, is about Baroque complexity as opposed to Romantic complexity. So it will be about the Baroque, very widely or broadly defined. And what we're planning to do is that there will be a series of essays, so very more or less conventional. But then there's going to be a corresponding website with all kinds of things, including Baroque music. So for me, the question is less, is it possible to create space for non-textual or non-print material? For me, the real question is, how do we create space for it so that this material is not just an illustration? So it's not something that you can refer to in a text. If you're interested in listening to this part of Bach's whatever piece, then go to this website. But more to create a space in which they can be appreciated on their own terms. I don't have an answer to this, but I think that it's important to to keep this problem in the foreground. So thanks, I really appreciate your question.
Scholarship, the conversation is actually in a medium to the scholarship itself. I think that's where the conversation is still.
Yeah, I think certainly, yeah, there's a difference, isn't there, between trying to open out the possibilities for conversation and listening, and something else which has to do with tradition, which has to do with the notion of fixity and originality and authenticity that, you know, we're kind of probably advised is necessarily contingent. You know, this is where I would recommend we all reread The Order of Things, probably on a weekly basis, because here we realise that there wasn't a humanities in the 17th and 18th century. It came about as a kind of division from the social sciences in the 19th century. So you know, and there's always inherent within these apparent fixities, these apparent kind of authentic places, something moving, something vital, something experimental. So there isn't, for me, a kind of a go-to place that needs to be properly represented or properly, it's without any kind of disrespect to work that tries to respect different voices and different modalities. I think that's a different question for me. You know, it's this notion that there's a kind of place, an original point or an authentic place to go that somehow solves the problem. I don't think the problem is solvable in that way. It has to be messier than that. It's dirtier than that. It's you know, it deals necessarily with the things that are happening to it, and part of what's happening to us is something very specific around marketization rather than digitization, I think.
Can I So I want to pick up on that as well. I actually agree with that. And I want to do that by pointing to a failure in our Folkvine project, or not a failure, but one of those times when we actually thought about what are we going to do in terms of our audience. So I mentioned to you the perversion of the miniature circus maker. And I want to come back to that because when we went to interview him, there was some paraphernalia and items that were part of a gay subculture, let's say. But he didn't want that as necessarily part of his legacy. He wanted it to be about the circus. So we had long conversations about that. What is the difference between doing a study about this person and doing community-based work? So in that sense, we didn't know. What we decided to do was to not include that. That would be a different kind of a study. And it might have humanized him because the circus culture is very, very odd and very contentious, and especially in the United States. I don't know if it is in the UK, but circus culture is very contentious because of animal rights, for example. And also because of the weirdness of circuses. So there was a lot of weird things that he showed us that we included in the site, but that most people would look at and go, this is deeply troubling. We sort of left it to the people to look at it to say, this is troubling or not. A lot of the clowns that we worked with talked about a culture that is disappearing because of PETA and other groups that have basically shut them down. Because if you know, in other groups, I mean, they used to do things in the circus that were making fun of people that they don't do anymore. So they've basically made it less circusy.
Something that Sarah said earlier on, which is really disturbing in a different way, which is about the relationship between scholarly research and academic capitalism, and the idea that there's just no way you can separate that. I mean, it's something as a new academic to this world. I've kind of seen it through the ref submission and various different institutional procedures. But I mean, is it really that bleak? You just think that's it?
Yeah, which doesn't mean that the sum of scholarship has something to do monetization. But I guess it's a way of saying how do we address that relation, and I felt that the Drucker piece addressed it in what was quite a classical way, really, which is to say, look, this thing called scholarship is important to us historically. It's tied to certain elements or institutions that we find important, including publishing, including teaching and research, and we have to protect it from the things that are happening and not get distracted by pixel dust, and she's absolutely right, about the not getting distracted thing, because as I think probably all agree, the solution does not lie in multimodality per se. It's not a solution to a problem, it's a strategy, it's a mode of working, it's a mode of possibly exploring things like methods and what we mean by it. So it's precisely that. It's saying, look, what are the ways you can address this more responsibly and perhaps more actively is by dealing with the trouble that we're in, and we all know that the trouble we're in. The UK system has had to deal with it pretty quick, I think, and it's been a bit shocking. And so the tendency, I think, is to sort of split things. This is quite often, I want to take it too much of a psychological or psychoanalytic perspective. We tend to hive things off. We'll protect this thing called scholarship from this thing called capital. Well, they were never separate entirely. They're joined in particular ways right now. How do we want to act in the academy in relationship to the knowledge we produce and the practices of scholarship, whilst taking account of, it's about taking account of and not pretending that we're untouched by or can be, preserving something that in itself, in any case, is historically contingent, was always part of a process of being involved in industry and utility and all the rest of it.
Can I just add to that? Because it really just brings to mind this example I very briefly showed earlier, the punishment preventive autotherapy. So this image of a person sitting on a chair with a bucket on his head. So in a way, I think, this was all about play, right? Creating, if you wish, places of otherness within which it's possible to play. And I guess multimodality is also a possibility to play, as long as it doesn't become part of the next ref. That you have to have 10 blog posts per person per year, otherwise you're not a good academic. No, but seriously, I think it's a little bit about experimenting also on ourselves as academic figures, and I quite like this idea of thinking about the scholar and entrepreneur, and think about how this can be, to stay with the Foucauldian line, how could we be subjectified otherwise, or not necessarily on these terms.
So can I ask, how much is setting up these presses for everyone a way of you creating a space to play? And how much is that in the university? How much is it more, you were talking about Samizdat being more kind of non-professional, and how much is that, where's that working, and how's that the relationship to being, because being entrepreneurial for a lot of our time in the university would have been seen as a bad thing and negative, and how much is that, how much are we able to play with that idea?
For sure, I'm a reluctant entrepreneur, but here we are. Just a little anecdote, I guess. When I went off to write the novel, it came very much out of feminist STS. It was the logical step from Haraway and Bradotti, right? It was just like, do it. Oh, okay, I'll do it. Somebody's got to go. And that came partly out of frustration with the severe limitations of communication inside the academy. If you're, playing the game, you're producing articles and monographs for university presses. It's very delimiting, very, very constraining in terms of the kinds of knowledge you're able to produce. For me, too constraining. So off I go and I I think, okay, I'll be a novelist then, I'll do experimental fiction. Okay, just how restricting was that process? Trade fiction? It was, restriction doesn't even come into it. Its rationale is hugely instrumentalized and marketized now. So yes, this is a very fascinating piece of experiment. Please make it more ordinary. No, that's not ordinary enough. Do it again. That's not quite ordinary enough. Do it again. Do it again. Do it again. Do it again. So running back to the academy, and then finding if you like, a little bit of in-between space, publishing an issue of Culture Machine, which Joanna and I could do bad things to because we were editing it. You find the little nooks and crannies, right? It comes down to nooks and crannies. It comes down to fault lines. It comes down to having just about enough clout to find a bit of space, a little bit of space to mess around in. And it was never going to be as clean as making a break from this or from that thing. And the press idea is completely tied to, for me, it's a political project. It is about what can I do from where I am to open the possibilities for myself, but probably not for me directly. It's unlikely that I would submit to my own editorial board, who will, by the way, be very frightening, I should imagine. But what kinds of spaces can I make? And knowing that's very hard. It's kind of a privilege to be able to do it, and it will be compromised, and it will play the other game always, and has to, in order to be viable, in order to be financially viable, in order to work within an institution that is, where we are right now. So, who knows? It starts off with its ideals, and there's no point in just it being an idealistic project. It's a political project. It's where's the space? How can I make it? How can I find it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that resonates very strongly with our experience, and I think the importance is about creating spaces, and spaces not in opposition to, but within an academic environment. And what I find really astounding is that so far, no one really has said no to us. So we've also assembled quite a frightening editorial board. We've commissioned a couple of manuscripts. We asked reviewers to review it and add their names to it, so to do open review. No, not a single person said no. And I think that this indicates that even though not many people are actively engaged in experimentation themselves, when someone comes with an idea, sometimes they are just happy to say yes.
And Craig, that seems to relate to your idea of kit bashing, and it's like people are kit bashing the university to make it do something more interesting and fun. And
yes, exactly. I was struck by Sarah's phrase early on, which was the spectacular display of productivity. So on the one hand, that's the one sort of thing that we're trying to avoid in some ways. On the other hand, that is always a threat. If you're just starting out in academia and you think it's bleak, that's the bleakness, the spectacular display of productivity. So what's happening in the United States around this is people are kit bashing, if you will, all of these models. So for example, Punctum Books and Punctum Records was started by one person, Eileen Joy. She was an academic in the middle of the country, which was very flat, and literally and figuratively. And so she quit. She had a tenured position at the University of Southern Illinois, and she quit. And instead, what she did is she set up Punctum Books, and she sells these pamphlet-length books that cost about $9 each, $9 or $10 each. And they're print on demand, and she's published, in a year and a half, she's published 60 books, and now it's up, I think, up to 70 books. And she started a record label, and she started a bunch of journals. this reminds me a lot of what Mattering Press is doing, and in some ways could be the, when I mentioned this to an academic friend of mine, he said that's both thrilling and terrifying. So for those just starting out in academia, that's sort of the thing that I think this panel has been about, is on the one hand, it's really exciting. On the other hand, it's terrifying. And, you know, so that's one model. Another model is Helen Burgess started Hyperrise and is the technical editor of another journal called Rhizomes, rhizomes.net. And in both of these journals, they're my friends. And what they said to me is, just do it. Just go out and just start your own, whatever it is. And in fact, that's what I'm being encouraged to do, is to start a press myself and just do what, and not have anything to do with the university. So, but I continue to think that the university press model is one that we should occupy. That is, we shouldn't just sit there and go, well, that we can't play in that circus. Instead, what I'm arguing is that we need to start university presses. So I hope that you will start one. And the mechanism here has been somewhat mystifying. I just keep doing it, and the administrators go, well, that's very exciting. They haven't given me any money, but they can't really say no to me because they haven't given me the funding yet. So in that sense, we're just open to start something. And at some point, I guess they might shut me down, but they haven't yet.
So we're doing the second panel now, and we're going to start with Karen Newman. Karen Newman is a research fellow here in digital media at Coventry University, where she's developing a pioneering new center for applied research and collaborative practice, Birmingham Open Media. So BOM will bring together artists, computer scientists, and researchers to produce new commissioned artworks and online interventions, exploring the impacts of emerging technologies on society and hacktivist culture. Newman's previous curatorial research outputs include award-winning commissioned projects with some of the most influential and exciting artists. She was curator at FACT, the UK's leading centre for art and technology between 2005 and 2010, where she contributed to Liverpool's flagship Capital of Culture programme and commissioned Apishapong Virathakul's critically acclaimed multi-platform artwork Primitive, which toured internationally and resulted in the Palme d'Or winning feature film at Cannes Film Festival in 2010. Karen, there you go.
Hello. Right, well, just to start off by giving a bit more background, really, because I don't think I really fit in neatly to the kind of scholarly academic box, or at least I felt like I didn't before I started this research fellowship. But you know, if there's anywhere that I would go and work in an academic setting, I guess it would be the Centre for Disruptive Media, because that is it really synergizes or synthesizes with a lot of the things that I'm interested in. So my previous curatorial research interests have been around the relationships between vision and memory and media. Yeah, I've been a curator for about 10 years, and then over the last year or so, I've actually been actively researching new creative business models within the arts, and thinking about kind of new creative and economic spaces as a result, or that could respond to opportunities in the contemporary creative and economic climate. So it's really interesting to be presenting today and aligning what I'm doing with some of the other kind of progressive business models that are being looked at. So, well, also just to kind of go back to basics a little bit, just for anyone that's still unclear, just to give a bit of clarity over the term disruptive media, because it's something that we tend to kind of refer to between ourselves quite a lot in the Centre for Disruptive Media. So disruptive media, according to Clayton Christensen, who's a professor in business administration at the Harvard Business School, is something that facilitates the production of a new market and a new network of values, and eventually succeeds in disrupting an already established market and value network, typically enabling new markets to emerge. So this image is a good case in point. The mobile phone with its built-in camera superseded video cameras and other kind of phones, and has kind of had a dramatic effect on the still and moving image camera markets as well. Just gonna move on a bit. And this is another great example of an artist's impression, I guess, of a kind of disruptive media. This is a Japanese artist called Onkawara, who made a series of works in 1971 called I Am Still Alive. And at this point, the telegram was a dying technology. It had been kind of fast replaced by fax technology and other faster forms of communication. And he was playing on the kind of gap and the evolution of the quick kind of evolution of technologies and what had been replaced in quite a short amount of time by referring to his own mortality. And so he would send a series of telegrams to his friends and colleagues around the world saying simply, "I am still alive." And it would take a day or two for the telegram to arrive. So the person would receive the telegram, quite unusual to receive a telegram in those days still, and think, oh, he's still alive. But actually, that was 2 days ago, so maybe there's something wrong. And so it's kind of playing on that, the idea of time and the succession of technology quite quickly. I really like that example. And all too often, I think, as researchers of disruptive media, I think we tend to refer to disruptive technologies in quite globalized terms. We refer to, the birth of the camera phone market and what that meant for the other kind of digital and analog film markets, and the effects of e-publishing, for example, and the implications that that kind of development has had on other kinds of scholarly publishing and other kinds of publishing. But I think there's a real opportunity here in the West Midlands to actually kind of look even more local and to actually begin to kind of think about some of the histories and local contexts here in the West Midlands that are actually really strong and really interesting for thinking about new business models for a different creative economy. So going back even further in time, I think one of the most disruptive innovations of all time possibly is Matthew Boulton and James Watt's steam engine. So this was developed through the 1700s, and it was largely responsible for the Industrial Revolution. It was a kind of key feature of transferring labour from humans to machines, and it was developed in Birmingham as a technology and exported in steam engines across the world. So it had a massive effect, not least on the West Midlands itself, which kind of suffered as a result of its troublesome technologies, and as a city, as a region that was known around the world as workshop of the world and city of 1,000 trades in Birmingham, that kind of industrial development had a massive impact. Birmingham also played a really key role in the evolution of photographic media. So lots of technologies were developed and ideas were developed, including silver plating. Silver plating was used as a fundamental part of the camera. Silver plates that were built into cameras and shipped across the world. And so that was a kind of key process in the evolution of photographic media. And also Alexandra Parkes invented celluloid as the first kind of mouldable plastic. So that had its own implications and massively contributed towards the development of the still and moving image as we know it, and mass exhibition, as well as contributing to other kinds of mass consumerisms as well. In fact, by the year 2000, 4,000 inventions copyrighted in the UK. 2,800 of those came from within a 35-mile radius of Birmingham. Peter Colgate of the Patent Office stated that every year Birmingham amazes us by coming up with thousands of inventions. It's impossible to explain, but the people in this area seem to have a remarkable ability to come up with and have the dedication to produce ideas. There's just a few examples of the many things that we've produced, including Coventry's production of the first ever British car, Daimler's first ever British car, which was manufactured here in Coventry in 1897. And the regions continue to play a leading role in manufacturing and industry. more recently, it's just been announced in the last few weeks, I think, that there's a new £40 million national aerospace technology programme that's been announced for Coventry, while Google still continue their work on trying to find a solution for a driverless car, and that offers further disruptions yet to come. So Walter Benjamin's 1936 essay, again kind of leaping back in time, but it's a kind of key text to kind of rethink where we are here in the West Midlands and what mechanical reproduction means today and for the region. His essay, Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, explores the effects of visual reproduction and the new possibilities afforded through photography and film for mass exhibition. So it was kind of quite a few years in, actually, to film and photographic practice as a whole, and kind of thinking through what implications that those disruptive media had had on the way that we think about art, the way that we think about the original, and the way that we think about a cult kind of status associated with art. He describes the transformation that photographic media had on perceptions, authoring, and transcending art's cult status. Benjamin's theory derives from Marx's philosophy, whereby modes of production form the basis for other social phenomena, including social relations and political systems, connecting ideas around class systems. And Marxism has gained new popularity in recent years, connecting ideas around class systems and thinking about contemporary capitalism in the wake of a global economic crisis. References can be seen in artistic programmes across cultural spheres over recent years, including exhibitions, festivals and publishing in the UK, particularly since 2012. The image at the bottom is an image from Liverpool Biennial in 2010, which featured a Marxist lounge with all of the kind of literature by Karl Marx and associated with Marxism. Urban studies theorist Richard Florida has talked about how the economic crisis currently has actually boosted innovation in his book, The Great Reset. He says these periods of crises and recovery are periods of the most rapid innovation in capitalism. And he goes on to say, when thinking about the economic crash and what would happen, I made the counter-proposition that in fact not only would cities like New York and London not fail as a result of the financial crash, but as of 2008, I said they would emerge stronger. And the shift change that Florida is referring to also involves a cull of broadly middle-class jobs, which has a particular resonance for the wave of creative destruction, as we're currently witnessing it, in relation to high culture. Creative destruction is a term also used by Karl Marx to think about capitalist development and how that results occurs as a result of creative destruction of the previous economic system. So here you can see that actually GVA, so gross value added, the products produced by a country, actually increased between around 2008, 2009, and it's continued to increase. So the creative industries have actually been very good at responding to opportunities for innovation despite other kind of silos of activity, such as museums, galleries and libraries, which have actually suffered as a result of public funding cuts. They've actually decreased their performances and productions and employability. So it seems that maybe those kinds of creative industries haven't been able to respond as quickly or effectively to some of the opportunities that the crisis has caused. So I kind of think about those in terms of the superstructures, the contemporary art superstructures that have evolved, particularly through the 20th century, and the GVA of the creative industries increased by 15.6% since 2008, compared with an increase of 5.4% for the rest of the UK economy. That's quite staggering, actually, that the creative industries had a much higher increase overall than the UK economy. And I think that's a really different picture to what a lot of contemporary art, publicly funded spaces would paint. The kind of contemporary art superstructure that was formed and evolved through the 20th century, which is predominantly 90% public funded by places like the Arts Council. In the 2013 report, Rebalancing the Creative Capital, A report by Peter Stark, Christopher Gordon and David Powell lobbied for the continued growth of clusters of internationally innovative and competitive cultural and creative production, contributing to sustainable regional and economic growth, and the development of new models for sustainable provisions of high-quality facilities and programmes for participation in and enjoyment of the arts, contributing to well-being in individuals and communities. That's a report that more heavily talks about or argues for a more equal distribution of funding between London and the region, which is, you know, an incredibly strong point which needs to be made. But there are little glimpses in that are also kind of relevant to thinking about, you know, what kind of new models. This is the most important thing from my point of view. What kind of new models of cultural production do we need to adopt in today's creative and economic climate to move forward and to kind of capture the rise in creative industries and economy that other initiatives have been able to respond to. So I think within the last 8 years particularly, and this is something that's formed a kind of key part of my research when thinking about new business models for the arts, has been the maker movement, which has enjoyed a burgeoning scene with hacker spaces and fab labs designed for DIY, cross-innovation and learning through doing. These spaces offer a range of tools from electronics, robotics, 3D printing, CNC tools, woodworking, metalworking, arts and crafts, a whole variety of things, round the clock, open access to members, and cross-innovation work. So opportunities to kind of learn through peer-to-peer production and different ways of learning. And more recently, some joined-up initiatives in London around the London Bridge Business Improvement District have been looking at cities such as Barcelona with thriving maker cultures to see how they could import that kind of cultural activity into a place like London and to see what it could potentially do for cultural regeneration. I've got a note to myself here, which was Craig was talking about how, you know, it's a kind of interesting connection to folklore actually, and thinking about folklore right now, and I think it's a really interesting connection to make here today. Is thinking about, as I have been, actually how can you respond to a subculture to kind of remodel the culture at large, and I think there's an opportunity there. Simultaneously, the rising cost of higher education and student debt has seen the rapid spread of open education or endeavours to provide open access to educational engagement and experience and open educational resources, of which the Centre for Disruptive Media has been a particularly active player. The Centre's media department was the first practical media department in the country to start broadcasting lectures to the iTunes U platform and to the YouTube Edu platform in 2009, following a boom in massive open online courses, or MOOCs, as they're also called. And the media department's innovated in teaching and learning through open technologies and pedagogies, including the development of the world's first open iPhone application for a photography degree course, as well as various other projects in open education and photography and creative activism. Living Books About Life is a great example of one of the university's, one of the centre's experiments in open access. This is a series edited by Claire Birchall, Gary Hall and Joanna Zalinska. That's a series of curated open access books about life, with life understood both philosophically and biologically, which provide a bridge between the humanities and the sciences. And it's produced by a globally distributed network of writers and editors. It repackages existing open source access science research by clustering it around selected topics, selected themes, whose unifying theme is life. So air, agriculture, bioethics, cosmetics, electronic waste, energy, numerology, pharmacology. So anyone can add to this, you can remix it, you can download it, you can contact the authors and contribute a book towards it if you so wish. Since 2012, the Wellcome Trust has also adopted a policy whereby all of the research it supports has to be made available in an online open access publication or repository as a condition of all of its funding that it gives out. And the new availability of open data, information that's available for anyone to use for any purpose at no cost, has provided greater transparency between the government's collection of data and public understanding, with initiatives such as www.data.gov and data.gov.uk designed to promote innovation that encourage the use and reuse of government data sets. And the Open Data Institute was also established in 2012 by Professor Nigel Shadbolt and Sir Tim Berners-Lee, catalysing the evolution of open data culture to create economic, environmental and social value. And they do a whole range of stuff. They just commissioned some artworks by various different creative practitioners, including Ellie Harrison, who made this great piece called Vending Machine, which sat in the offices of the Open Data Institute and was hooked up to various different news streams online. So whenever there was news of a financial crisis, the vending machine would automatically empty its whole contents. So it would give free food. So a really nice piece of work. Okay, and one of the Centre's latest experiments is a new model of applied research for art and technology called BOM, or Birmingham Open Media. Birmingham Open Media responds to the substantial developments in digital culture that phenomenon like open access, open data and open source offer. BOM seeks to explore new creative practices and debates relating to open media and our everyday interaction with technologies. BOM's the major output of my research fellowship in digital media within the Centre, which began in August. And I'm already feeling the pressure to deliver the output before the end of my research fellowship in August. So our new commissions will bring together, as Yannicka said, artists, technologists and researchers to collaborate on cross-innovation artworks using interactive technologies and interventions in the public realm. That includes interventions across the internet, exploring things like steganography, which is the process of concealing secret information in image files, as was used by the terrorists who organised 9/11. BOM sits within an emerging practice of art and technology centres, such as iShed in Bristol, Culture Lab and Mixed Reality Lab, Culture Lab in Newcastle and Mixed Reality Lab in Nottingham. And these kind of new spaces offer different ways for producing cultural content and audience engagement, typically bringing together creative practitioners such as artists with researchers and technologists to develop cross-innovation collaborative projects which eventually find their way to public audiences. Research is central to these new spaces, and this is something that I looked at a lot in my research, and like what kind of new program do artists need to innovate and create going forward, and what kind of programs do audiences need to engage with that have currency and urgency. So iShed, for example, partners with the University of the West of England and Bristol University. Mixed Reality Lab is based at Nottingham University, and Culture Lab is based at Newcastle University. And these collaborations allow for the spaces, such as iShed and Culture Lab and Mixed Reality Lab. They offer those organisations free access to specialist academic and technical knowledge. And for the higher education institution, they offer valuable research outputs with critical recognition exterior to the academic environment, which can be used for submission to, for example, the Research Excellence Framework, or REF, to attract future research funding and develop the prestige of the institution. And I think this is also it's a nice way of kind of moving forward and working, and a kind of move away from the way that I've previously worked with researchers and research-based practices. So this was a project kind of tagged onto an exhibition which I curated at FACT, Foundation for Art and Creative Technology in Liverpool. We did an exhibition called Persistence of Vision, which looked at the interplay of vision, memory, media. And we, as part of that process, I wanted to work with vision experts and memory studies experts and neuroscientists, and kind of pull together different ways of thinking. I guess I'm always kind of, to my own trouble, sometimes actually interested in different perspectives, and I would rather not just work with a memory studies expert or a neuroscientist and just go with their opinion, but I'd rather just collect a range of different perspectives when I'm putting together a creative program, and to kind of let those different perspectives influence the way that I develop a project, an exhibition, a curated exhibition, you know, or let it inform a conversation with an artist, which actually develops somewhere along the line into a new piece of artwork. So with this project, I don't think this was the best exhibition that I've ever curated at all. However, it was the easiest one for the university to get their head around in terms of the REF submission. So we did a group exhibition in the gallery with 9 different international contemporary artists, a lot of new work around the exhibition thematic, and then we commissioned a series of interactive touchscreen games in our media lounge, which we used as the kind of first encounter with our audience. So we worked with the Visual Perception Lab at Liverpool University. We created these games which explored things like matrix memory and face recognition and spatial awareness and those sorts of things. And we got people, we were interested in basically the kind of re-evaluating how brains were being wired and behaviours were being directed differently, post-digital, native. So the idea that actually everyone's grown up with technology in the new generation, how do they now respond to different stimuli, and how is that different to our digital immigrants? So we captured a lot of data from these online games. We did it online, and we did it physical interfaces in the media lounge. And the data that we captured was fed back to the Visual Perception Lab for them to study and to use towards their sort of future research. We also commissioned pretty sort of standard publication, bringing together different perspectives from the memory studies experts and different the neuroscientist and me and the other curator wrote a text, and we kind of pulled together all of that kind of thinking in a publication. And the exhibition toured. But actually, I mean, that's all great, but then you go on to your next exhibition, or actually curators often have a break, and while another curator does something, and then you come back to it. And so your kind of curatorial research interests kind of fluctuate, and things kind of come back in and out of sight for audiences. Most of the time they're not. And you kind of call back on people that you might have known years ago. Anyway, what's great about being inside a university and creating cultural programs, but working within a university, is that it gives you access and surrounds you with academic thought and knowledge, awareness of what other people are doing and interests, and makes you approach things in really different terms. So I think this is a much more kind of sustainable and thought through model of practice, and I think that's why it's working really well in places like iShed and Mixed Reality Lab and Culture Lab, is because they have that ongoing relationship with the university. Not just a relationship, but it is the academic. It's turning the model inside out in a way. It's like putting the academics in the arts institution and working towards outputs that are collaborative and that have mutual benefit for everybody. Where are we? So here we go, back to BOM. So BOM will offer cross-innovation artworks commissions. So in the kinds of ways that I was describing, we'll develop those through hackathons in our lab space. Co-working spaces for artists. So the image on the left is one of the spaces that will be used as a kind of co-working bench and table. So kind of moving away from artists' kind of traditional artist studio settings. It's kind of piloting something, just trying to get my head around membership fees, because actually co-working is a really successful phenomenon recently for office workers. It's a kind of new concept, I think, in terms of the way that artists work outside of the hackerspace world. So yeah, we're gonna try that. We're gonna try and put artists together and let them brush shoulders with technologists and all kinds of other creative people. We'll have a photography studio. So I've got a mix of we're a social enterprise, absolutely don't want to be a charity. I've got 2 commercial partnerships on board that cover the rent. One of them is a photography studio, which is moving into the basement, a commercial photography studio. And the other is a cafe partner. And we'll do a whole range of stuff with Google Hangouts, digital production facilities. We'll have an old-fashioned darkroom as well. So we offer a whole range of kind of digital and analog production facilities and thinking spaces. It looks pretty crap at the moment, and it will probably still look a bit crap when it's done, because we've got a really minimal budget. It's taken about 9 months of negotiation to get £35,000 private investment from a company, which is literally half of the budget. I've just got my Arts Council funding, which is 30k, so we can kind of kick off the capital project, but it is still going to look pretty raw. This is IBEAM, Centre for Art and Technology in New York. So retaining all the kind of breeze block and the brick and all that kind of stuff, the idea is that it's a space where artists and researchers and people can just come together and meet and share ideas and mess up, and it doesn't matter if it gets messy. And this is one of the disruptive media that I'm actually exploring at the moment, which is a fucking giant roasting machine, which has its own disruptive implications for a building which is 8 stories high and needs a flue going all the way to the top of the building. But in terms of where the space sits, which is in a business improvement district, there currently isn't a great footfall around where the space is. So it looks here, and if I could get onto Google Street View, I'd show you around. It's opposite an adult cinema, which I quite like the idea. It's conveniently situated between Legs 11 and Adult World. And so for me, this could be the new Soho of Birmingham. But you know, if you look at the moment, and this was also part of the thinking, that at the moment, if you come into Birmingham, and Birmingham was important, by the way, because probably much to the disappointment of Coventry, for me, moving down from Liverpool and thinking about a space to put a national artist support programme for digital media and photography, I needed to be close to a train station. I needed to be close to the kind of main point that people come into the city. So it's for national audiences as well as kind of local. And so for me, I really wanted to be close to the train station. At the moment, as a cultural destination, the city doesn't really work. Actually, Coventry works a lot better than Birmingham at the moment. But you come into New Street and you either go 15 minutes to the left to get to Icon, or you'd go 15 minutes to the right to get down to where all the other cool stuff is happening in Digbeth. And occasionally you might go to the library or to the Museum and Art Gallery, but generally you wouldn't. So BOM is trying to be a kind of agent for creative regeneration, but also to try and kind of sit in the middle of everything and help to join things up a bit. And it looks like that. So I've just kind of run away there. But yeah, just kind of in terms of the centre and what it's trying to do in terms of exploring counter-models to sort of traditional models of academic learning and things like the University of Culture, which have been referred to before, and the University of Excellence, and removing barriers between formal and informal learning, access and engagement, and supporting continuous professional development. So this is a way that BOM can help, because we'll be supporting creative entrepreneurs. I know that word's been used quite a bit today. We'll be doing that through mentoring and support packages and social entrepreneurs network, as well as co-working space, as well as all of the production facilities and commissions and events that we have going on as well. So we'll be doing that as a kind of inside-outside model to how we learn in the classroom here, and how people will continue learning after they leave the university. And so just to kind of end really on an image that I think is particularly pertinent in terms of where the West Midlands are, as, you know, a region that's kind of been built around the car, and you really feel that if you come to somewhere like Coventry, that the flyover still really dominates, the kind of physical flyover and whatever that is. Artist Namjoon Paik's essay, Media Planning for the Post-Industrial Society, the 21st Century, is now only 26 years away. He presented that paper at the Rockefeller Foundation in 1974, at a time when the West Midlands was also already starting to feel the disruption of its own car manufacturing industry's decline. Pike pictured an altogether different kind of highway, the electronic superhighway. So he proposed the idea of the information superhighway, and he foresaw a broadband communication revolution in amazing detail, even at that point, with all of the possibilities for instant unifying connectedness that the internet would bring in years to follow. He felt that moving to America from Korea, and actually feeling the kind of disconnect and kind of social chaos and a kind of ethnic split, of a cultural kind of split. And he saw the way that potentially new media could be used as a kind of connected television between children's living rooms and connect cultures together. Kind of amazing vision at that point. And I think maybe this is kind of something interesting to kind of leave on in terms of thinking where the West Midlands is, because for all of its clumsy accomplishments, I think the region seems particularly well placed to remodel itself as a UK leading centre for creative innovation, albeit a different kind of superhighway to the one that we have built. Thanks.
So I'm just going to introduce Mark America now. So Mark America has exhibited his interdisciplinary artwork in many venues, including the Whitney Biennale, the Walker Arts Centre, the Denver Art Museum, the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London, the Istanbul Biennale, the Biennale de Montréal, and the American Museum of the Moving Image. His comprehensive mid-career retrospective was recently exhibited at the National Museum of Contemporary Art in Athens. A cult novelist, media theorist, web publisher, and live audio-visual artist who has performed internationally, America is the author of many books of fiction and non-fiction, including his recently published book, Remix the Book, by University of Minnesota Press, and a large collection of artist writings entitled Metadata and Digital Poetics, also by the MIT Press.
Glitch. Ontology. Glitch. Ontology. Glitch. Ontology. Glitch. Ontology. The verbi, voco, visual apparatus, corrupted, corrupted. At its core, rupturing, the image faces its digital other and wonders, can I relate? Can I relate? Can I relate to the other images intersubjectively remixing their stories on the go in auto-affect mode? The images say, I too am digital. The images seem to ask, but how can I relate? How can I remediate? Is there a virtual light at the end of the tunnel? Emitted by whom? Captured by what? Processed through what remixological apparatus? What apparatus already finds itself unconsciously pre-programming our aesthetic vision of a literature still yet to come? To come, as in to write. To come to writing. This glitch mechanism has been making a ghost appearance for centuries now. Think of it as the specter of e-lit, of networked literary presence, of intersubjective agency captured in the transmission of mirroring neurons. Mirroring neurons. You can read about it in the freely downloadable user's manual. I'm thinking of that section where it is written, quote, engineering the difference via optimized ontological machining. This fused deconstruction modeling program enables vital critical making like never before. You too can experience the pleasure of the text by simply allowing yourself to machine the machine. Machine the machine. Some assemblage required. Some textual frottage required. Rubbing these algorithmic texts together as if to generate some kind of heat and conjure up yet more digital images. Is this what it means to charge language to the utmost possible degree? These images keep making their apparition of an appearance and ask us, what does it mean to program desire in a robotic world that strains to create? These too are the images of the world we travel through, the world of cognitive mapping and QuickTime virtual light stitched together as a glitch collage made out of the source material everywhere. And it was written, glitch is the soul in the machine. Everybody, please join in. Glitch is the soul in the machine. Together, glitch is the soul in the machine. Yes, glitch is the soul in the machine. Glitch is the soul in the machine, even as that same machine machines the glitch in its own image. And as anyone with a history of dead bodies lying in their wake will tell you, hacking that process is always already an inside job. We can say every story is a travel story, a spatial practice. These spatial practices, these trance rituals, transfigured in time, are wired into our DNA. These interstitial rubbings, these moments of textual frottage, why is it so stimulating to me? Why can't I keep my eyes off it? Writing is the flesh I just can't keep my eyes off of. Writing is the strange attractor I just can't stop rubbing myself against. It's driving me wild, again, always, and I really can't stop myself. I just want to touch it, writing, to lick its outer edge, writing, and slowly, if it will let me, go in deep. Go in deep and take hold of it the way I take hold of any apparatus, and just make it come back to writing, to write, to turn it on while mutually remediating. A profusion of uncensored glitch markings that leave a raw data trace. The hand-coded smear of a glitchy markup language that always tells the tale of metadata, the tale of by the tale of metadata circulating in this intersubjectively worked space foods mediating.
Thank you, Mark. The video is now ended. So if you want to come in.
Yep. So, and you might consider that a creative outcome, one that's generated from a practice-based research methodology sponsored primarily by the UK's Abandoned Normal Devices in conjunction with Corner House and FACT Liverpool and the former Folly in Lancaster, but also the Atlas Institute and the Center for Humanities and Art, both located at the University of Colorado. And it's an excerpt from my project, Museum of Glitch Aesthetics, which is at glitchmuseum.com, and I think we have it on the screen if you want to just click the homepage. Thanks. So the last time that I actually performed my Glitch Ontology Manifesto as an opening was before a live audience. It was last November at the Conservatoire in the heart of Paris as part of my recent stint as the LABEX International Research Chair at the University of Paris 8, where my colleagues invited me to deliver what they termed, and I'll put it in quotes, a hybrid conference, something that really has no definition or translation in English per se, but that, because we don't know what it is, means we can discover it on our own as part of the heuretic process. By heuretic, I'm actually referring to Gregory Ulmer's book Heuretics, where he starts off talking about grammatology and says that theory is assimilated into the humanities in two principal ways, by critical interpretation and by artistic experimentation. And so this, to me, is what makes that kind of post-humanities, to borrow the terminology for this event, practice-based. The artist as performer, new media theorist, applied remixologist, maybe provocateur of radical pedagogy can creatively hack the institutional context they find themselves in, should they be, say, as in my case, a professor of art and art history, but who also, really out of necessity, is still the same underground fiction writer they've always been. See, for example, my 1993 novel, Coffin Chronicles, or the 1995 novelization or Songs of Nadoror. That novel is called Sexual Blood. So this hybrid conference that I was asked to give in Paris, it ends up as something like an embodied praxis, one that performs its theoretical agenda by sampling from whatever source material feels attractive at the time of composition and can be intuitively manipulated for aesthetic purpose, or if not purpose, then at least playfulness, or if not aesthetic playfulness, maybe what I mean is aesthetic fitness, as in the survival of the fittest, because it is an embodied praxis after all. So when I ended the reading of the Glitch Ontology Manifesto in Paris a few months ago, I didn't really segue into the next bit by saying, you know, that's a creative outcome and it's one that's generated from a practice-based research methodology, you know, sponsored by this unusual alignment of UK arts organizations powered by, as Anne likes to refer to themselves, the anarchic imagination, as well as these various academic units at the University of Colorado. Instead, after the video stopped playing, and I had finished delivering the manifesto on the same stage that Berlioz debuted his Symphonie Fantastique in 1830, after everything had come to a momentary standstill, there was a long pause, we'll call it a pregnant pause, and I looked out at the audience and I asked, what else am I going to be able to remix? And the reason I asked that question is because this underground novelist in me, the one who transcribes his unconscious readiness potential into these morphing theoretical fictions across all manner of transmedia interfaces and digitally contextualized compositional environments, is always looking for. I'm always looking for, we might even say hunting for, more source material to sample from so as to continually feed my creative intellect and transmute whatever energy there may be in the source material into a kind of pseudo-autobiographical narrative, one that supposedly runs parallel to the life and times of this figure whose cloud of metadata somehow translates into the work of a persona referred to in the Museum of Glitch Aesthetics as the artist 2.0. So the Glitch Ontology Manifesto that gets sampled into the hybrid conference is actually an outgrowth of the Museum of Glitch Aesthetics, or what we have ended up calling MOGA for short. And I say we because MOGA is a collaborative art project that challenges what I think to be conventional fine arts and humanities practices. In fact, to my utter surprise, although I think I have finally gotten used to it, we is a dangerous word in a Department of Art and Art History, especially one that still finds itself not only rooted in, but in a way stuck in the muck of 19th century studio art practices and the scholarly art histories that run parallel to them. So we is not the individual studio artist as genius, but more like the collaboratively networked realm of the potential scenius, to use Eno's term. We who do it ourselves and see where imaginary practices in the process of being discovered can take us. So I mentioned that in many ways this idea of the practice-based researcher is a kind of extension of the underground fiction writer that I've always been. And that's another way of saying being a practice-based researcher is really what it means to be a kind of creative manipulator of data and its ability to creatively manipulate data by lucidly evolving one's aesthetically attuned remixological filters that I think we can begin disrupting and altering not only the humanities landscape, but perhaps the stuck in the mud position of so much of the STEM fields that, for example, the creative industries find themselves codependent on. So it ends up that for me, DH has always stood for disrupting or disruptive humanities. And the digital part is just the latest evolutionary instance of what has always felt like a rival tradition in art and writing, one that can be traced back as far as you want to go. I'll choose to go with, say, Lawrence Stern as a metafictionally attuned practice-based researcher disrupting the interface. But there, in this case, the interface of the book or the literary interface, but there obviously are many more. So my basic theory when it comes to practice-based research in early 21st century, digitally networked culture is that back in the day, at least this is based off my experience in Colorado, back in the day, if you wanted to play with technology, and especially if you wanted to have access to the tools that would allow you to experiment with computational processes, most of the time you had to go into fields like engineering or computer science. But the dramatic shifts that have taken place in consumer culture, from the introduction of the personal computer to accessing the fast speed internet to nomadically wandering the desert of the real by way of semi-smart mobile media technologies now at our disposal, have really reset the operational and behavioral conditions that we find ourselves in. So having access to the necessary digital media technology, one needs to start experimenting in their own fictional undertakings, their construction of online, digital, or flux personae by way of intuitive and aesthetic manipulation of the data of everyday life, has opened up humanities research to an area that practice-based researchers are quite familiar with, right? The field of making, right? Image making, conceptual language making, film making, performance making, even object making, theory making, database making, remix, code making, social media performance making. My students today who outside of the institution are all about the using of digital media technologies to personally express themselves often find themselves kind of time traveling back into a world that resembles 1980s academia, as if none of this other stuff has ever happened. Meanwhile, most, if not all of the students in my seminar this semester started using the internet when they were 4 or 5 years old. And I don't take that term using very lightly. It's a term that floats around the underground drug culture as well and relates to the algebra of need, a phrase introduced to us by the beatnik junkie writer William Burroughs. In fact, in an interview for the 50th anniversary publication of Naked Lunch, Burroughs was asked about the algebra of need, and he responded by saying, "By the algebra of need, I simply meant that given certain known facts in an equation, and the equation comprising a situation of absolute need, any form of need, you can predict the results. Leave a sick junkie in the back room of a drugstore and only one result is possible. The same is true of anyone in a state of absolute hunger, absolute fear. The more absolute the need, the more predictable the behavior." Now, I'm not, of course, trying to compare all of our mobile phone toting, Facebook updating, Twittering students to heroin addicts. In fact, the speed with which many of us, even transitional figures who started on the internet in our 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, have unconsciously embedded these emerging and now quite instrumental operational behaviors into our conceptual machinery, excuse me, signals an opening for the culture at large to reimagine what it means to become, say, an innovative artist operating in the rival tradition. In the case of the avant-garde, it may be even referred to as an anti-tradition, a kind of a living archive composed of what in Remix the Book I call source material everywhere. And that repositions this hybridized practice-based researcher post-humanist as an applied remixologist who models different versions of how to do the humanities as an activist, say, hack, think process worth personally expressing yourself in. So as someone who's not only big on documenting their creative project development, but also theorizing, excuse me, and speculating on future forms of artistic practice, as well as their relationship to the university's growing interest in creative research and pedagogy, my goal has been, is, and always will be to advocate for a more advanced avant-garde arts research agenda as an essential part of the university. And we, in fact, are starting a new practice-based PhD program in intermedia art, writing, and performance at Colorado. And the main reason I advocate for this kind of thing is because I think it's becoming clear to all the stakeholders that practice-based artistic research methods involve creative work processes that provide a valuable alternative to the more ingrained scholarly practices and scientific practices. And there are perhaps two predictable outcomes. For example, the scholarly monograph, or even in an academic arts context, the fine arts gallery show. And now that so many of our students have access to the conceptual machinery required to operationalize their ongoing and unconsciously generated information behaviors, I wonder if even there's a choice in the matter. How else to stay aesthetically fit? I think I'll end it there, and thank you very much.
So are there any questions for either Mark or Karen? Any ideas, comments?
The idea of innovation's come up quite a bit, hasn't it?
actually today, which is quite interesting. Sort of redefining what innovation is today and new models, new structures to be able to deal with what innovation is and how it happens differently, which I think is quite nice. There's a few things that have come up, which is nice connections to make. Sorry, did you have a question? I'll stop talking.
Yeah, thanks a lot for both presentations. Very interesting connections and very interesting contrast between the two. And I would like to maybe pick up on Mark's very final sentence, how to stay fit aesthetically. I really like that question. And let me kind of bring that back to the first talk, because what struck me was the omnipresence of the word lab and laboratories in relation to all these experiments. And coming from science studies, for me, laboratories are or have been kind of conventionally conceived of as, well, not very creative places, because the whole idea is that they discover things that are supposed to exist anyway. Whereas I guess what you've been trying to articulate was exactly new modes of creation. And so basically, this is just a comment and maybe also an invitation to Mark to think about, okay, what are the others of labs when it comes to creative process? How could we stay fit aesthetically that is not necessarily the aesthetics of laboratories?
Yeah, sure. Good questions. So as part of this new practice-based PhD program in intermediate art writing and performance, we're trying to find ways to bring artists and humanists together in what we are calling a studio collaboratory. And it's not really just artists and humanists. Those would be the primary players in the studio collaboratory. But we'd also invite others as well, media studies scholars, information scientists, etc. In fact, we're finding that there's a bit of stuck in the mudness in the science labs right now in terms of like how to generate innovation and creativity. And they're turning more and more to the studio critique model as a way to try and initiate some collaborative energy and bring people in from different areas. So the lab itself, we might call it a playground as well, or a sandbox. It's really more just like an open setting for researchers to collaborate with each other. Maybe it's even more like a meta lab. It's kind of like an umbrella for various research projects to take place in.
Just add to that, I remember turning up at the visual perception lab at Liverpool University years ago, being really disappointed that actually it was just a room with some things on the wall, and didn't, and then actually went to see a visual perception, a vision scientist in a different department, and he showed me some much more sexy looking equipment, so I kind of felt a bit more satisfied. But I think the idea of a lab, certainly within the arts, is kind of thought about as, it's a concept, right? It's used as a sort of like I was using the word kitchen for a long time. I kind of thought about BOM as an artist's kitchen, where people would just meet and cook up ideas and experiment. It's just it's a space for exchange. And from what Mark was saying as well, actually the collaboration and knowledge exchange has come across in recent years as being more and more important. And I think this is one way that universities can play a really key role in broader cultural programs, because they are filled with brilliant academics with great ideas that have far too much time to think, that actually can be really inspiring and influential to artistic programs and the way that artists develop their ideas and other people develop their ideas, and they can be challenging in all sorts of ways. And so for me, the lab is it's the space. It's not even, we don't even have the Centre for Disruptive Media isn't even a real building. It's not a centre. We're it doesn't really exist. But in the same way that a kind of lab doesn't necessarily need to be a physical place with sexy equipment. I
Yeah, I mean, it's I hear myself talking to myself, so I had to stop for a second. It's also a kind of building on what Karen's talking about. It seems like a more fluid and hybridized concept of what a lab can be. So it can exist online, it can exist in modular spaces, and also, I must say, something that I've always been interested in my role here in Colorado is locating ways to bring it out into the community. So we have alternative galleries and museums throughout the Denver Boulder region who we partner with. And so what we might think of as the lab, which is basically where a lot of us meet and collaborate and research, we then bring it out into the community. And that's, in a way, just taking the lab to another space. So it's really sort of hybridized in that way.
You talk about glitch, which to me essentially means error, which sort of harks back to the old analog days. Why don't you go back to analog? And also, how does remix radically differ from postmodernism?
Yeah. I was going to also mention when Karen had talked about going to that other lab and finding all the sexy equipment there. One of the things that's kind of interesting from the perspective of I think, folks who are identifying with disruptive digital humanities is that older equipment is in some cases sexy as well. One of the labs that we're collaborating with here in Colorado is called the Media Archaeology Lab, and there's lots of old computers and equipment, floppy disks, etc., around, and we're using those computers actually to investigate works of electronic literature and early works of net art in their native environments, right? The technology, the hardware, software that they were originally created on, and using that as source material to develop new work in. Regarding the history of remix, it goes way back, of course. That's why I mentioned, in fact, my own remix of La Trémonde's The Songs of Maldoror as part of, it was basically my second novel called Sexual Blood. The first one, The Kafka Chronicles, is kind of an elaborate remix of Metamorphosis by Kafka as well. If you read La Trémonde's The Songs of Maldoror, you'll realize that he was very much a plagiarist. He said that plagiarism was necessary and that progress depended on it. And so he was pulling from a lot of the Goth Lit and other scientific manuals, etc., of his time. I mentioned William Burroughs in my presentation and the Algebra of Need. Of course, Burroughs, with the painter Brian Geisen, was responsible for having started the literary cut-up. You can look at the way that the Cubists were integrating material elements into the paint, like chair caning or newspapers, etc., all the way through, Situationist de Tournemont, of course, was part of the history of remix as well. So remix appropriation methods have a long history. And so I'm not trying to suggest that there's anything particularly new about the idea of remix. In fact, if you look at the Open Humanities Press book that I created in conjunction with Gary and the other editors, you'll see that I'm suggesting that it's actually co-evolutionary. It's like it's part of who we are, and it goes all the way back to the beginning in a way. Like we're all born remixers is the way that I put it in Remix the book. And there's also a survey of other forms of remix and other ways of looking at it, including like film collage at the remixthebook.com website. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that history that it grows out of, and then just look at how it's being put into practice today with the data of everyday life, or what I call the source material everywhere, sort of at our fingertips, and how easy it is to manipulate that data and screw it up, to use Flusser's term, and then redistribute it throughout the network.
Yeah, just also, I mean, I'm a big fan of old media, and actually the last place that I worked after FACT was a photography gallery, and we went through a capital project and the director decided not to have a dark room because there was this idea that actually all artists just work digitally nowadays. But it's rubbish, actually. The number of artists that would say to me, or photographers, you're going to have a dark room, and they really miss the social space, the communication and collaboration that was come through that physical space, but also the opportunity to experiment with old histories and old medias, and it's also about kind of craft and skill, and dying. As technologies move on, then there becomes an interest in old technologies as well, and that's really a way of kind of recontextualizing and rehistoricizing and lending sort of fresh light to what's going on now with different technologies. And so I think that's really important. But also, just in relation to glitch, I think glitch is a really interesting area in terms of cybersecurity. It's the place where problems happen. So one thing I've been keen to do here in the Centre for Disruptive Media is to try and broker a partnership with the Ethical Hacking Lab at Coventry University, which sometimes gets me into trouble. We've got really different approaches to how we think about hacking. And for me, the kind of tension between those two approaches is a really interesting space. Because, it's where the problems happen and actually where the really interesting things impact that's ripe for exploration, I think.
And this is why this kind of curial activity is, I think, so important. Karen's mentioning the tensions with the other lab. You think of curation also as a practice-based research process, and perhaps one of the primary ways of hacking or culturally critiquing, the very creative industries and security industries and spying industries that are kind of growing up all around us. And that the arts and humanities now find themselves somewhat codependent on. And so how do we hack those systems?
Hello. I'm having some trouble formulating this question, really, but I'm not quite sure. It might come out a bit vague, and I'm a bit wary of stepping on science studies kind of territory. But I'm just concerned about the kind of creative destruction of the humanities and the kind of new model of knowledge production based on fluid, non-existent laboratories of interdisciplinary, etc., etc. But how far is that a part of the marketisation of higher education, and does that not worry anyone? I mean, we kind of talked about this in the original panel, and then there's this uncomfortable synergy, to use a university management term, between the critical theory and the production of new modes of knowledge production and all this sort of stuff. And where does the critique come into it? The traditional role of humanities, etc. And it sounds kind of spectacularly productive, these, to go back to this earlier term, these laboratories of creative production and stuff, I don't, you know what I mean? It's a kind of open, vague question, but it worries me a little bit.
Well, I think worrying is a good thing. I think Woody Allen's made a career out of it, actually. And those are the kinds of questions or worries that we would want to bring into lab. So it's not so much an embrace of innovation and the creative economies or industries. It's accepting the fact that is part of the dialogue now in the ongoing corporatization of the university, and then using it as source material, again, to hack into. I was talking in the presentation and the performance I gave, I kind of sample from Ezra Pound talking about, and I think I mentioned in relation to glitch being possibly the charging language to the utmost possible degree. He was referring to poetry, of course. But, so to be aware of Pound and to be aware of his writing, for example, and his theorizing as an artist, and then to sample from it and bring it into performance, and then to bring that into a hybridized, fluid, yes, interdisciplinary or intermedia lab setting within a university that invites artists and researchers from many different backgrounds to come in and address these questions and to address these worries and to anticipate where the questions are and the future worries are going to be is something that I think is quite necessary. It doesn't necessarily mean that everybody who identifies themselves as an academic artist or a humanities scholar has to actually do that, or be, as just a mode of survival. These things can coexist, but they do need to coexist. It's not that one is less relevant than the other, and in fact, they work together. It's kind of what I'm getting at.
Gary's the perfect person to answer this one.
But Gary is the perfect
University
person
of
to answer.
Okay, let me try and think. Okay, so we're very worried about critique. But if we, Karen started off and she's talking about Marx and things, but if we'd have said, it's the Centre for the Study of Marx, or it's the Centre for the Study for Dialectical, Hegelianism or something, we'd have lasted about 2 minutes, or they wouldn't have let us set it up, or whatever. And partly one of the issues around critique, and it kind of goes back to what Sarah was saying, is about finding little spaces and niches. One of the things people would say theoretically about critique is it's kind of too oppositional, too obvious. You can kind of, you're just standing yourself up there as a target, and they're going to get you. And it's harder and harder to have spaces for critique in the universities. It's trying to find a space in the university where we'll get away with some of this stuff. They're going to put pressure on us for targets and finances and things, and it's the same, there's less funding for the arts and art centres. But can we come up with something that's kind of going to have that double role? So it does have a space for entrepreneurialism and the kind of creative and cultural entrepreneurialism that Karen's specialising in, that Sarah was talking about in like scholars, entrepreneurs. For example, I was in a conference in Mexico, and that was on critical management studies. But they were saying because Mexico public funding is not really great and doesn't survive very well, so they have to kind of work as entrepreneurs to just do interesting critical work. But their argument is, well, why does entrepreneurship have to be just associated with the right? And why let them have, the Conservatives let them have that space? Can we not do something interesting with it? So at least they're kind of trying. So we're doing that. At the same time, we're trying to engage with, as Karen was saying, different forms of economies, different forms of operating things. It's trying to do both. The problem with it is it's not simple. It's not without ambiguity. It's not without paradox or contradiction or any of those things. So, but we're not going to find a space that isn't, or it seems very hard.
Hello. Hello, Mark. It's not Gary anymore. Sarah. I found myself really relating a lot to what you... I loved your manifesto, and was really listening hard to what you were saying about writing, because I was talking a bit about that myself. Coming from somewhere very connected and also very disconnected, I think, in relationship to you, particularly a kind of feminist history of debates on writing, going back from Haraway to Sisu, etc., where writing embodiment, writing situatedness is an issue, it's a burden, it's a strategy. And then I was trying to connect the glitching and writing together, and wanting to hear a bit more about that. And if glitching is a kind of writing, I guess what I want to know is, where's it happening, where's it coming from, and what does it want? I guess I'm referring to what you were suggesting about the connections between system, cybernetics, and fiction. Your canon of fiction I recognise, but it's gendered. So where does the glitching happen in relationship to system, in relationship to not so much author, but authority?
Yep, great questions. You may not be familiar with my 97 work, Grammatron. It was out there before Web 2.0, and it starts off with the word écriture, and then it goes to a creature, and then it moves into a writing machine. And so it's kind of a reading of Cixous and Derrida's grammatology, but it's narrativized, I like to say metafictionalized, within what at the time was called hypertextual space, soon to become net art, as they tagged it. And so that's kind of where my connection to some of the French post-structuralist writers and trying to find ways, for some sort of textual frottage between the different texts and seeing ways to remix them within a new media context started taking shape. It was soon thereafter, say the third part of my net art trilogy. So Grammatron was first, phoneme or phone me or phony me, depending how you pronounce it, was second, and film text was third, and that was actually commissioned by the ICA and PlayStation 2 as part of the How to Be an Internet Art retrospective that I had, I think it was in 2001, 2002. And soon thereafter, I was invited to a few places to actually perform film text, which I thought was a net artwork. So performing, I wasn't quite sure what that meant in terms of the invitation. And so I didn't want to go and do it like a typical demo, even though the film text work, which I can't show you right now, or I would, is an interactive kind of like remix writing machine. But the difference, you might say, between what I was doing with Grammatron and what I was doing with film text was that I was starting to integrate more video imagery. And so as a part of that invitation to, or as a result of that invitation to perform film text, both in Switzerland and in Japan, I decided to get into what was then developing as live audio visual performance, or what we were calling VJing, right? Video or visual jockey performance. And it was during that time of traveling and experiencing different levels of memory and remix and accessing or capturing source material wherever I was and remixing that into each successive performance that I started getting into the idea of developing the idea of image écriture, something like an image writing, but again, looking at it from a practice-based research perspective, taking some of the ideas of writing out of the body, but using the source material that I was engaging with and capturing as part of the tour, right? Every story is a travel story, a spatial practice. And so the more I did that, the more I saw the interaction with the technology, with the network and with my laptop glitching images. And I found that quite interesting. And so then it became an instrumental part of my developing artist theory of image écriture, which I develop in the first section of Metadata, which is a book I published in 2007. So that's how I kind of bring it all into the writing, live performance, image mix.
I'll take us back to the space concept. As a digital artist myself, I find working more and more into the cyberspace rather than the physical space, even though I'm almost graduating photography, which is happening in the physical space. My main concern is that by working more and more in the cyberspace, I tend to relate or be members of communities that live there, and of course living in the physical space that creates a gap, let's say, within me, which I'm trying to fill. And both of you talked about spaces that you are creating or will create, and I'm wondering how can these spaces answer questions as this one, because it is inherent to the digital apparatus to live in the cyberspace. How can we bring that to the physical space? And I don't know if you're familiar with, well, there are many artists working in that way that bring objects from the one world to the other, or the New Aesthetics blog from James Brittle. Yeah, that is my personal concern, to be honest.
Well, first of all, it's great that you're digitally connected at university, because when you leave, you're not going to have anyone around you unless you do link up with a space like BOM. So that's brilliant. At least you've kind of tapped into some kind of virtual network that hopefully will, continue for you after uni, and that's really important. I think BOM is certainly trying to bridge the gap and to do things over, for example, Google Hangout and discussions and things like that will exist virtually and connect up people that it can't physically, which will also be published, open access and all that kind of stuff. Everything that we do, that we can, we'll share. But yeah, I mean, we believe, I guess, when I came to the university, actually, I was kind of more interested in the physical relationship and what's kind of happened as a result of more interaction through, digitally and virtually, and how that affects the kind of people that we are and our relationships and all that sort of thing. And maybe through the kind of research of just talking to loads of people, loads of artists and peers and whatever, what emerged is that it's really important for people to have a physical space, and that actually that is really missing today. The physical spaces are really kind of missing today as well. So hopefully we can try and do a bit of both. But I don't know, Mark. What do you think, Mark?
Well, we're as I was suggesting, we're actually hybridizing it so that we're very interested in bringing it out in the community. Unfortunately, when you live in a kind of upper middle class community like Boulder, you don't have access to these spaces like BOM. This is one of the reasons why I spend so much time in the UK and other parts of the world, because it's very difficult to start and sustain these kinds of spaces in most parts of the US. So what we do is we have to sort of actively collaborate and partner, let's say, with spaces that already exist that are being developed by oftentimes socially conscious and aesthetically aware entrepreneurs who are starting, say, alternative presses, but are turning their shop into a gallery, which then becomes a performance space. And so through performances and exhibitions and partnering with events that take place off the campus, but then also partnering with alternative, say, digital or electronic sound festivals that take place within the region, and having them come into our seminar space or into our black box space and bring folks from the community who are engaged with the emerging social media network environment, and bringing them into our spaces on campus, and then turning them on to the kinds of research that we're doing, which sometimes is actually quite simpatico. I think you really it takes a lot of work to do that, of course, because it takes you away from your research, because you're actual developing and, say, loosely finishing your outcomes so that they can get out there. But it's definitely worth it, because what you're doing is you're building this community that exists both in person and online. So it's kind of worth it, actually.
I think we need to stop there. So I'd like to thank all our fantastic speakers of today, and I hope we can give them a big final applause too.